The train slowed before Evelyn Mercer could fully prepare herself, which was how most things in her life had gone, arriving before she was ready, leaving before she could hold on. She pressed her palm flat against the window glass, cold even through her glove, and watched Red Creek materialize from the gray morning like something reluctant to be seen. It was smaller than she'd imagined. Most things were, once you arrived. The main street ran maybe 200 yards between a feed store on one end and what looked like a saloon on the other, with a scattering of storefronts between them that wore their weathered paint like old men wearing suits that no longer fit. A water tower leaned slightly to the left. 3 horses stood tied at a rail outside the general store, their breath coming in small white clouds. Wyoming in late October had no interest in being pretty. Evelyn pulled her traveling bag from the overhead rack and set it on the seat beside her. Inside was everything she owned that mattered. 2 dresses, a set of her mother's silver hairpins, a small bundle of letters tied with a piece of ribbon that had once been blue but had faded to something closer to gray. Those letters. She'd read each one so many times she could have recited them from memory, and she almost had, on the long nights crossing Kansas when sleep wouldn't come, and the car rocked and swayed, and she'd wondered for the 100th time whether she was making the worst mistake of her life or finally making the right one. "I am not a man given to easy words," the first letter had said, in handwriting that slanted slightly upward as if straining toward something. "But I am a man who believes in plain truth, and the plain truth is that I am lonely, and my son is lonely, and this ranch needs a woman who isn't afraid of hard work or hard weather. I won't pretend to offer you romance, but I will offer you honesty, a roof, and a fair chance to build something real." She had read that letter in the kitchen of the Hartford boarding house where she'd been living for 6 months after losing her position as a bookkeeper at Mercer and Associates, her late father's firm, which had been swallowed whole by a man named Victor Blackwell, with the casual efficiency of someone eating breakfast. She'd been given 3 days to vacate the office, 2 weeks to vacate her apartment, and no apology whatsoever. The letter had felt like someone opening a window in a room she hadn't realized was suffocating her. She wrote back. He wrote back. Over 4 months, they'd exchanged 9 letters, and while none of them were what anyone would call romantic, they were honest in a way she hadn't experienced in years. He told her about the ranch, Kane's Crossing, 400 acres outside Red Creek, good grazing land, a stream that ran clean most of the year. He told her about his son, Thomas, who was 8 years old and quiet in the way children sometimes got quiet after something terrible happened. He didn't say what the terrible thing was, and she didn't ask, not yet. She told him she was 31 years old, that she had no family left, that she could keep accounts and manage a household and wasn't frightened of physical work. She didn't tell him about Blackwell, not all of it. There were things she wasn't ready to put in a letter. By the 3rd month, they had agreed she would come. The train stopped with a long, shuddering sigh. Evelyn stood, smoothed her skirt, dark blue wool, the better of her 2 dresses, and picked up her bag. Her other trunk was in the cargo car. She'd need to arrange for it to be brought to the ranch. One thing at a time. She stepped down onto the platform and the cold hit her immediately, a sharp, clean cold that was different from Hartford cold, which was wet and gray and got into your bones with malicious intent. This cold was more direct. It came from everywhere at once and didn't apologize. There were perhaps a dozen people on the platform, most of them focused on their own arrivals and departures. She scanned the faces, looking for the man she'd been exchanging letters with for 4 months, the man she'd crossed 1,000 miles of prairie to meet. She found him almost immediately. He was standing at the far end of the platform, apart from the small cluster of people near the station door. Tall. She'd known that from his description of himself, with dark hair going gray at the temples and a jaw that looked like it had been carved rather than grown. He wore a canvas work coat and boots with honest mud on them, and he was holding his hat in both hands in front of him the way men sometimes did when they didn't know what to do with their hands. He was looking at her. She started toward him, her bag over her arm, managing a small smile that she hoped looked more confident than she felt. She was maybe 10 yards away when she saw his expression change. It was subtle at first, a tightening around the eyes, a slight shift in the set of his mouth. She'd been reading people's faces her whole life out of professional necessity, and she recognized the look before her brain had fully processed what it meant. He didn't know her, not the way he should have. She stopped walking without meaning to. A woman behind her nearly collided with her back and muttered something irritated, but Evelyn barely heard it. "Mr. Kane," she said. He was looking at her the way you looked at a stranger who'd called you by name, startled, cautious, wary, in a way that raised the small hairs on the back of her neck. "That's right," he said carefully. "I'm Evelyn Mercer." She kept her voice steady through an act of will. "We've been corresponding. I've come from Hartford." The silence that followed lasted perhaps 3 seconds. It felt much longer. Something moved through his face that she couldn't fully name. Confusion first, then something sharper, like the moment before a storm when the air pressure drops and every animal goes still. "I don't know any Evelyn Mercer," Wyatt Kane said. She heard someone on the platform laugh. Not at her specifically, probably just a coincidence of timing, someone reacting to something else entirely. But the sound landed like a stone thrown directly at her chest. "I beg your pardon?" she said. "I haven't written to anyone in Hartford." He said it evenly, not cruelly, which almost made it worse. "I haven't written to anyone. I don't know what arrangement you think was made, but I'm not the man who made it." She opened her mouth and closed it again. Behind her, she could feel the slow accumulation of attention from the other people on the platform. The particular quality of stillness that settled over a public space when something uncomfortable was happening, and everyone was trying to look like they weren't watching. "I have your letters," she said quietly. She set her bag down and opened it, hands steady through sheer stubbornness, and drew out the bundle. 9 letters over 4 months. This is your name and your address on each one of them. Kane's Crossing Ranch, Red Creek, Wyoming. He looked at the letters. The expression on his face shifted again, past confusion, past wariness, into something that looked uncomfortably like recognition of an entirely different kind. "May I see one?" he said. She handed him the first letter. He read it. His jaw tightened. "This isn't my handwriting," he said. She stopped, looked at the letter in his hand, then at his face. "What?" "This isn't my handwriting." He said it again, more quietly. "I can see the style is similar. Someone who knows my hand well enough made a reasonable imitation. But it's not mine." The platform had definitely gone quiet around them now. She was aware of it the way you were aware of a wound before the pain arrived. That moment of strange clarity where you knew something was wrong before you'd fully felt it. "Then who wrote them?" she said. She watched him work through it, watched the moment it landed. "God," he said, under his breath, which wasn't really an answer, and then he looked past her shoulder toward the station, and whatever he saw there made his expression do something complicated and terrible. She turned. A boy was standing in the station doorway. 8 years old, maybe, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes that were too large for his face, the kind of eyes children got when they'd spent too long being scared. He was wearing a coat that was slightly too big for him, and boots that were definitely too big. And he was watching Wyatt with an expression that contained, in approximately equal parts, hope and the particular terror of a person who knows they are about to be caught. "Thomas," Wyatt said. The boy didn't run. To his credit, and Evelyn would think about this later, this small, specific courage. He didn't run. "I wrote the letters," Thomas Kane said. His voice was thin, but it didn't shake. "I copied your handwriting from the letters you kept in the desk. I practiced for 2 weeks before I wrote the first one." The silence on the platform was absolute. Wyatt started, then stopped. He looked at Evelyn. He looked back at his son. The muscles in his jaw worked. "She sounded like she needed somewhere to go," Thomas said, looking not at his father but at Evelyn now, and his voice finally did crack on the last word, just slightly. "And I thought we needed—" He stopped, swallowed. "I'm sorry. I'm really sorry. I didn't think I just thought if you met her, you'd—" "Thomas!" Wyatt's voice came out harder than he probably meant it to. The boy flinched. Evelyn stood on the platform of Red Creek Station with the letters in her hand and the cold working its way through her coat, and she thought about Hartford. She thought about the day Blackwell's people had come to her father's office with the legal documents and the polite smiles and the total absence of anything that could be called conscience. She thought about the boarding house kitchen and the letter that had felt like a window opening. She thought about 1,000 miles of prairie crossed on the strength of a child's handwriting. She did not cry. She had learned in the past 2 years that crying was a luxury that required a safe place, and she was not in a safe place. "What's your name?" she said to the boy. He blinked at her. "Thomas. Thomas Kane." "I gathered that." She kept her voice very even. "How old are you?" "8." A pause. 8 3/4. "And you practiced Mr. Kane's handwriting for 2 weeks before you wrote to me." Thomas nodded, miserable and still not running. "That's actually," she said, after a moment, "a considerable amount of dedication for 8 years old." Someone behind her on the platform let out a small, surprised sound. It might have been a laugh, or it might have been something else entirely. "Miss Mercer," Wyatt said, and she could hear in his voice that he was trying to locate something. The right words, the right tone, something that would address the situation without making it worse. And he was clearly not a man who was practiced at that particular navigation. "I don't know what to say to you. I can't. This isn't something I had any part of, and I can't." "I understand that," she said. "You've traveled a considerable distance under false. I understand that too. I can arrange for your ticket back." "No." The word came out before she'd fully decided to say it. She picked up her traveling bag from where she'd set it down on the platform. "Mr. Kane, I have $42, 1 trunk in your cargo car, 2 dresses, and nowhere to go back to. The man who sent me the letters—" She glanced at Thomas, who was watching her with those 2 large eyes, "is 8 3/4 years old and appears to have read my situation more clearly than I'd written it. I'm not going back to Hartford." Wyatt stared at her. "I need a place to stay while I work out what comes next," she said. "You have a ranch with a spare room, I presume? I can cook, I can keep accounts, I can do whatever needs doing. I'm not asking for charity. I'll work." She looked at him steadily. "1 month. If it doesn't suit either of us, I'll find another arrangement. But I'm not getting on a train back to nothing." The station platform held its breath. Wyatt Kane looked at her for a long moment, long enough that she had time to consider the real possibility he was going to say no, and long enough that she had time to feel the full weight of what that would mean. And then he looked at his son, who had crossed the platform at some point and was now standing 4 feet away with his hands twisted together in front of him. "Get your trunk," Wyatt said finally. He looked at neither of them when he said it. "Wagons out front. We leave in 10 minutes. The ride to Kane's Crossing took the better part of 2 hours, and it was not a comfortable 2 hours. The road, if it could be called that, ran northwest from Red Creek through scrubland that got lonelier the farther you went, the town shrinking behind them until it was just a dark smudge against the pale sky. The wagon bench sat 3 across, which meant Evelyn was wedged between Wyatt on her left and Thomas on her right, close enough to feel the warmth radiating off the boy's thin shoulders, close enough to see that Wyatt's hands on the reins were gripped considerably tighter than the horses required. Nobody spoke for the first 20 minutes. Thomas broke first. "Are you angry?" he asked. He was addressing Evelyn, not his father. "I haven't decided yet," she said. "Are you going to leave?" "I just told your father I wasn't." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "He says things he doesn't mean sometimes, when he's upset. He might change his mind." "Thomas," Wyatt said, without inflection, "I'm just saying she should know." "She doesn't need you to." "It's all right," Evelyn said. "Let him talk." She glanced at Thomas. "What made you decide to do it?" He'd clearly thought about this, or thought about how to answer it, which wasn't quite the same thing. "Mrs. Alderman at the dry goods store said Papa was going to run the ranch into the ground because he couldn't keep good help and he didn't have a wife to manage the house. She was talking to Mrs. Holt and she didn't know I was there." He paused. "And Papa he works all the time. He doesn't sleep. I hear him walking around at night." "Thomas." Wyatt's voice was quieter this time. "He never talks about Mama anymore," Thomas continued, with the specific, devastating honesty of a child who didn't fully understand what he was doing with it. "But I know he thinks about her because sometimes I see him standing in the kitchen just looking at nothing. And I thought if there was someone else there, someone who needed to be there, then maybe he'd stop looking at nothing." The wagon wheels found a rut, and the whole vehicle shuddered. Evelyn braced herself against the motion, and when she looked at Wyatt's profile, she found it entirely unreadable. which she was beginning to understand was itself a kind of answer. "Your mother," she said carefully to Thomas. "How long has she been gone?" 3 years. He said it the way children said things that adults had rehearsed into them. With a flatness that didn't mean the wound was healed, it meant the wound had been learned to live with. "She died in the spring. It was an accident." He didn't elaborate. She didn't ask. "Well," she said after a moment, "I think what you did was wrong." Thomas hunched slightly. "I think it was dishonest, and it put both me and your father in an extremely difficult position, and that you are old enough to have known that." She kept her voice matter-of-fact, not cruel. "I also think you're clever enough to have pulled it off for 4 months, which is genuinely impressive and also alarming. And I think," she paused, choosing the next part carefully, "that you wrote me 9 letters because you were worried about your father. And that's not a bad reason. It's just not a good method." Thomas looked at her sideways. "Are you going to yell at me?" "I don't yell. Papa doesn't either." He seemed to be comparing notes. "He just gets very quiet." She glanced at Wyatt, who was, in fact, very quiet. "Does that work?" she asked. "Sometimes," Thomas said. "Not always." Eat. Kane's Crossing was not what she'd pictured. She had pictured, without fully acknowledging she was doing it, something modest but well-maintained, something that said, "Hard work has been done here and will continue to be." She had pictured the house from the letters, the wide front porch, the view of the mountains to the west, the stream that ran clean most of the year. What she found was a house that had clearly once been cared for and had spent 3 years slowly forgetting what that felt like. The porch boards were sound, but the railings needed paint or replacement, or both. One window on the upper floor had a crack in the glass that had been covered with a piece of oilcloth that had since come loose on one side. The yard held a confusion of equipment, fence posts, rope, an overturned water barrel, and the kind of accumulated disorder that happened when one person was trying to manage the work of 3. The main barn looked solid. She noticed he'd prioritized the barn, which was practically sensible even if it meant the house suffered. And there were cattle visible in the near pasture, a decent-sized herd for one man to manage. The inside of the house was clean. She'd give him that. Dusty in the corners, and the kitchen showed the specific chaos of a man cooking for himself and a child with very limited patience for the process. But the floors had been swept, and there were no dishes left out, and the firewood was stacked with some attention to order. Thomas showed her to the spare room upstairs without being asked. It was small, with a single window that looked west, a narrow bed with a quilt that had seen better decades, and a washstand with a pitcher and basin that were both dry. But the floor didn't creak more than 3 times on the way to the bed, and the walls were solid and the window latch worked. And Evelyn had been sleeping in a boarding house room for 6 months with walls thin enough to hear every conversation in the adjacent rooms, so the baseline for privacy felt genuinely good. "It's fine," she said. "It's good, actually. Thank you." Thomas stood in the doorway. He'd been alternating since the station between guilt and a tentative, cautious hope that she found almost more difficult to look at than the guilt. "There's water in the pump in the kitchen. I'll bring some up if you want." "I can manage." She set her traveling bag on the bed. "Thomas, go find your father and apologize properly." "I already said sorry on the platform." "That was in front of an audience. It doesn't count." He looked like he might argue, and then didn't. She heard his boots on the stairs, and then the sound of the back door, and then the yard. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed and pressed her hands flat on her thighs and breathed. 1 month. She'd said 1 month, and she'd meant it as a statement of confidence, but the truth was she had no idea what she was doing. She had $42 and no position and no family, and a man who hadn't agreed to her presence so much as failed to actively refuse it. And she was sitting in a dead woman's house trying to find the particular kind of courage that wasn't brave so much as just out of options. She pressed her hands flat on her thighs and breathed. "Fine," she thought. "Fine. Figure out what you can do and start doing it." She came downstairs an hour later to find Wyatt at the kitchen table with papers spread in front of him. Ledgers, by the look of them, though he'd pushed them aside when she heard her on the stairs. He was sitting with a cup of coffee that had probably been hot an hour ago and staring at the wall. "Mr. Kane," she said. "Wyatt," he said it without looking up. "We can skip the formality. It seems—" A pause. It seems we're past it. Wyatt. She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down without being invited, which was the only way she'd ever learned to establish ground in a difficult situation. What do you need done? He looked at her then. His eyes were darker than she'd expected. Not black, but a very deep brown that in the low kitchen light looked like it. He had the kind of face that probably didn't give much away under ordinary circumstances, but 3 years of hard living had etched some of it around the eyes and the corners of his mouth, and grief had a specific texture she'd learned to recognize. I beg your pardon? On the ranch, she said. What needs doing that isn't getting done? You're a man running a 400-acre operation alone, and from the state of the kitchen, I'd estimate you're cooking about 1 real meal per day, and the rest is whatever comes to hand. Your paperwork? She nodded toward the ledgers he'd pushed aside. Looks like it hasn't been organized in some time. Tell me what you need, and I'll see what I can do. He was quiet for a moment. You were a bookkeeper. For 8 years. In Hartford. At my father's firm. Until... She stopped. Until I wasn't. He let that alone. The ledgers are a mess, he said finally. I can manage the cattle well enough, and Denny, the hand I've got, he comes 3 days a week, manages the fence work and the heavier lifting. But the accounting has gotten away from me. I know what's coming in and what's going out, but I haven't had time to put it in proper order, and the bank in Laramie has been asking questions about the operating loan. I can sort the accounts, she said. Give me 3 days with those ledgers, and I'll have them in order. After that, she paused, looking around the kitchen. The house is manageable. I'll need to know where you keep things. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite classify. Not warm, not hostile, something in between that was mostly just careful, like a man who'd learned to be careful with things he couldn't afford to lose. You don't have to, he started. I said I would work, she said, and kept her voice level. I meant it. A silence stretched between them. Outside, somewhere in the yard, she heard Thomas's voice and then a horse's response. Not words, obviously, just the low woof of a large animal being spoken to. There's a list, Wyatt said. On the wall by the door. Things I've been meaning to get to. He stood, took his cold coffee to the sink. Help yourself to whatever's in the pantry. It's not well stocked. I'll go to town Saturday. I'll come with you, she said. I can make a proper list. He paused at the sink, didn't turn around. All right, he said. Sat. The first week was the strangest of her life, which was saying something. She started with the ledgers. Wyatt had not been exaggerating. They were a mess. 18 months of records kept in a system that had started with good intentions and devolved into a series of notes written on whatever paper was available, some of it tucked between the ledger pages, some of it in a separate notebook, some of it apparently memorized and not written down at all. She sat at the kitchen table for 3 solid days, working from early morning until the light failed, and by the end of the 3rd day, she had a clear picture of the ranch's finances that she suspected was more comprehensive than Wyatt had had in months. The picture was not comfortable. Kane's Crossing was not failing, but it was not thriving either. The operating loan from Laramie was at a high interest rate, and the repayments were eating a significant portion of the cattle revenue. 2 good seasons, she estimated, with careful management, could bring them to solid ground. 1 bad season could tip it the wrong way. She organized everything into a proper ledger system, noted the discrepancies between what had been paid and what had been recorded, and left a summary page on top with a note explaining what she'd found and what she recommended. Wyatt found it that evening when he came in from the barn. He stood at the kitchen table reading it while she made supper, a proper supper, roasted potatoes and whatever dried beans she'd found in the pantry, and a reasonable approximation of a stew from the beef he'd brought in from the cold room. And she'd been paying enough attention to the sounds of the house in a week to know that his silence was a different quality than his usual silence. This is thorough, he said finally. I noticed you've been overpaying on the Caldwell freight account, she said, without turning around. They've been double billing for the winter haul for at least 2 seasons. You're owed roughly $40. Another silence. I didn't know that, he said. I didn't imagine you did. Thomas came in from whatever he'd been doing outside. In the evenings, she'd noticed he gravitated toward the barn, toward the horses. The way some children found more ease with animals than with people, and stopped in the doorway with his nose up, smelling the supper. That's not what supper usually smells like, he said. Sit down, Evelyn said. Wash your hands first. They're not. They absolutely are. I watched you come in from the barn. A small skirmish of expression crossed Thomas's face, the universal expression of a child who wants to argue and has done enough arithmetic to know it won't pay off. He went to wash his hands. Wyatt set the ledger summary down and looked at her. She was dishing up the stew, keeping her back mostly to him, which she'd discovered early on was an easier way to have certain conversations, less confrontational, less like a standoff. Thank you, he said. It came out rough at the edges, like a word that hadn't been used much. You can thank me by speaking to the Caldwell Freight Company, she said. They'll resist. Insist. I know Caldwell, he said. He'll resist. He overcharged you $40 on the assumption that you were too busy to notice. That's worth resisting back at. Thomas came back from the washroom and climbed into his chair and looked at the bowl she set in front of him with an expression that was trying to be skeptical and failing because the stew smelled good and he was 8 years old and had been eating his father's functional but joyless cooking for 3 years. He took a bite. His face did something involuntary. It's good, he said, as if she'd accused him of thinking so. I know, she said, and sat down. Ish. Red Creek, Evelyn learned on the Saturday trip to town, had very specific opinions about Wyatt Kane and even more specific ones about her. She noticed it first at the general store, in the way the conversation between Mrs. Alderman and a woman she didn't know yet stopped just slightly too sharply when she and Wyatt came through the door, and the way it resumed after a pause that was a second too long to be natural. She noticed it in the way the man behind the counter at the feed store, Holt, his name was, she'd connect the name to the wife Thomas had mentioned, managed to be genuinely friendly to Wyatt and entirely blank toward her without any apparent sense of contradiction. She noticed it most in the way two women outside the post office watched her cross the street and then turned to each other with the particular economy of movement that meant something was being said with efficiency. Word got around, she said to Wyatt when they'd loaded the wagon and were eating the dry sandwiches she'd put together from the pantry before they left. He didn't pretend not to know what she meant. Small town. What exactly got around? He was quiet for a moment. That you came expecting to marry me and I didn't know who you were. He said it without embellishment. People have their versions. I imagine they do. She looked at the main street, at the faces that kept finding reasons to look in their direction. What's the kindest version? Probably that you were deceived and came from a long way off, and it wasn't your fault. And the unkind one? He didn't answer immediately. She looked at him and found him looking straight ahead, jaw set. Wyatt? That a woman who travels alone to marry a man she's never met must have been desperate or not right in her choices. I see. She ate the rest of her sandwich. They're not entirely wrong about the desperate part, she said. I am, somewhat, but I found that being accurate about your own situation is more useful than being embarrassed by it. He looked at her then, sideways, the way he'd started doing when she said things he hadn't expected. You're a strange woman, he said, not unkindly. So I've been told. She brushed the crumbs off her lap. I think you should know that I intend to go to the post office and mail the letter to the Caldwell account. And if I see Mrs. Alderman again, I'm going to be pleasant to her even if she doesn't deserve it. Small towns either get used to you or they don't, but you can't give them the satisfaction of running. He was quiet. You might tell me, she said, what you'd like them to believe about the arrangement, whether you want me to say anything specific or nothing at all. Tell them whatever's true, he said. Tell them you're staying for now and doing what needs doing. That's all it is. She nodded. All right. She got down from this wagon and went to the post office, and on the way back she stopped and introduced herself to Mrs. Alderman, who had all the body language of someone who hadn't expected to be spoken to and wasn't sure how to react to it. Evelyn was pleasant and direct, and mentioned casually that she was helping put the ranch accounts in order, and she asked whether Mrs. Alderman knew anything about a reliable carpenter in town, because the front porch railings at Kane's Crossing needed attention. She did this because it was practical. She did need a carpenter. And because she had learned 2 years ago that the best way to neutralize gossip was to replace it with information. When she got back to the wagon, Thomas was sitting in the back eating a piece of hard candy he'd gotten from somewhere, and Wyatt was watching her with that unclassifiable expression she'd started to associate with moments when she'd done something unexpected. She climbed up onto the bench. "There's a carpenter named Ellis," she said. "He can come Thursday." Wyatt looked at her for another moment, and then he took up the reins and clicked to the horses, and they headed back through the thin October light toward the ranch. And for a while the only sounds were the wheels and the hooves and the wind off the mountains and Thomas humming something tuneless in the back. It was not comfortable. It was not anything like what she'd imagined the journey ending in. But she was there, and she was not running, and sometimes that was the whole of what you could say about a situation. That night, she sat by the window in her room and listened to the ranch settle into quiet, and somewhere below she heard the familiar sound, the sound Thomas had described, of footsteps moving through the kitchen at an hour when there was no reason to be awake. Back and forth, back and forth. She didn't go down. It wasn't her place yet, and might never be. But she lay awake longer than she'd meant to, listening, and in the morning she came down early and made coffee and left a cup at his place at the table and didn't say anything about it when he came in from the early chores and found it there, already the right temperature, as if she'd timed it without meaning to. He drank it without comment. Thomas came downstairs and ate his breakfast and talked, as he was starting to do more in the mornings, about the horses, about a fox he'd seen near the east fence, about whether it would snow before Christmas, and whether she'd ever seen snow in Hartford, which apparently was a different kind of snow than Wyoming snow. Outside, the mountains stood against the sky the way they'd been standing before any of them arrived, and would go on standing after. The cold had settled in properly overnight, and the ground was hard and the grass was pale, and Evelyn Mercer sat at the table of a house that wasn't hers yet, and maybe never would be, and drank her coffee and listened to a boy talk about snow. The second week was harder in some ways and easier in others. Easier because she knew the house now, knew which pump stuck in the cold, knew that the oven ran hot on the left side, knew that Thomas needed to be called twice in the morning before he'd actually get up, and that he would eat almost anything if it came with enough bread. Knew that Wyatt came in from the barn at 6:30, and that he drank his coffee black, and that he read the 2-week-old newspapers from Laramie that arrived in batches, and folded them back into their exact original shape when he finished, which she found inexplicably both telling and touching. Harder, because she'd been there long enough for the novelty of survival to wear off, and the actual shape of the situation to become visible. She was a woman alone, without family, without position, dependent on the tolerance of a man who had not chosen her, and was managing that tolerance with the stiff courtesy of someone who'd decided to handle a difficult situation by pretending it was normal. The town thought what it thought. The money she had left would last her 2 months if she was careful, less if she had to pay for lodging. She thought about this in the evenings after Thomas was in bed and Wyatt was in his study with his papers, and she thought about it practically rather than emotionally because the emotional version led nowhere useful. She had skills. The accounts were done and done well. Wyatt had said so in 3 words, which she was learning was effusive for him. She could cook. She could manage a household. She could handle correspondence and organization and the kind of administrative work that ranches needed and rarely had anyone to do. She was not frightened of hard work, and she was not easily discouraged, and she turned this over carefully in her mind, without vanity but without false modesty either. She was the kind of person who, once she decided to stay somewhere, stayed. The question was what Wyatt Kane was going to decide. The answer came, somewhat sideways, at the end of the second week. She'd been out at the near pasture fence with Denny, the hired hand, who had turned out to be a taciturn man of about 50, with a face like weathered leather and no apparent interest in the drama of her arrival, which she found restful. He'd shown her, at her request, what he was doing with the fence repair, and she'd noted 3 places where the posts were sunk shallow enough to be a problem in the spring when the ground softened, and made a note in the small book she'd taken to carrying in her coat pocket. When she got back to the house, Wyatt was in the kitchen. He'd come in early, which was unusual, and he was standing at the counter with his back to her, looking at something she couldn't see, and she stopped in the doorway because something in the line of his shoulders told her she'd walked in on a private moment. He heard her anyway. "Denny says you were looking at the fence posts," he said without turning. 3 of the posts on the east run are shallow. They'll need resetting before spring or you'll have cattle in the road. A pause. "He's right about that. I knew about it." "I know you knew about it. I was noting it so I could put it in the repair schedule I'm making." He turned then, and she saw what he'd been looking at. A photograph, she realized. a small one in a simple frame. He set it down on the counter, face down, in a gesture so automatic she didn't think he was entirely aware he'd done it. "You're making a repair schedule," he said. "The list on the wall isn't organized by priority or season," she said. "I'm putting it in order. It'll be easier to plan the work." He was looking at her. She met his eyes and waited, because she'd learned that Wyatt Kane had things he wanted to say that sometimes needed room to surface. "You're planning to stay," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "I said 1 month," she said. "I've been here 2 weeks." "I know how long you've been here." He was quiet for a moment. "I want to ask you something." "Go ahead." "Why here?" He set his hands flat on the counter, looking at them. "You had... Thomas showed me the letters you wrote. Your letters. You're clearly intelligent, you can keep accounts, you could find work in a city. Why, when this turned out to be what it was, why not go somewhere else? Somewhere that actually made sense?" She thought about how to answer that honestly. "I told you," she said. "I had nowhere to go back to. That's part of it." "That's not all of it." She looked at him for a moment. "The letters your son wrote," she said carefully. "Even though he forged your name, they said true things. That this place needed someone who wasn't afraid of hard work or hard weather. That you weren't offering romance, you were offering honesty and a fair chance." She paused. "That was what I wanted. Not a promise, a chance. I don't need things to be easy. I need them to be real." She looked at the photograph lying face down on the counter and then back at him. "I think that's probably also true for you. That you don't need things to be easy. You need them to be real." The kitchen was very quiet. "She died 3 years ago," he said. He wasn't looking at her. "Sarah, it was..." He stopped. "It was an accident. A horse. She was an excellent rider, which is part of why I never..." He stopped again. "There's no good way to tell that story." "You don't have to tell it," she said. "I know I don't have to." He picked up the photograph and set it upright. She could see it now. A woman, young, dark-haired, with a smile that looked like it had been surprised out of her by whoever was behind the camera. "Thomas doesn't talk about her. We don't. I don't know if that's wrong." "I don't know either," she said, honestly. "But I think a boy who misses his mother enough to write 9 letters to a stranger might need someone to talk to her about eventually." He was quiet for so long she thought he wasn't going to respond. "Stay," he said finally. His voice came out rough, and he didn't look at her. "Past the month, if you're willing. We'll figure out the arrangement, the proper one." She looked at the photo of Sarah Kane, and at the man standing with his hands flat on the counter, and at the house that had 3 years of grief worked into the walls alongside the dust. "All right," she said. She went to start supper, and neither of them said anything else about it, and that was somehow exactly the right amount of words for what had just happened. By the end of October, the repair schedule was posted on the wall by the door, organized by season and urgency. The ledgers were current. The front porch had new railings. Ellis the carpenter had done good work and charged a fair price, and the crack in the upstairs window had been properly glazed rather than covered with oilcloth. Thomas had started tentatively, leaving small offerings on the kitchen table, a stone he'd found by the stream that had an unusual shape, a hawk feather, once a hand-drawn map of the ranch that was remarkably accurate for a child who'd apparently made it from memory. She kept all of them. She put the stone and the feather on the windowsill in her room. She pinned the map to the kitchen wall beside the repair schedule. When he noticed the map on the wall, he said nothing about it, but she caught him looking at it twice that evening with an expression she recognized from her own mirror, the face of someone trying not to show they were moved. Wyatt was still Wyatt. Not warm, exactly, not easy. He didn't talk much, and when he did, it was mostly about the ranch, about the cattle prices and the weather, and the state of the road to town. But he'd stopped being careful with her in quite the same way. The stiffness was still there, but it had shifted in quality. From the stiffness of someone tolerating an intrusion to the stiffness of someone who'd decided not to keep their guard up every single minute and wasn't entirely sure what to do with the resulting space. She didn't push. She didn't try to fill the space. She just kept doing what needed doing, and she kept her own space, and she let whatever was or wasn't happening in that house happen at whatever pace it chose. At night, she still heard him sometimes. The footsteps in the kitchen, back and forth, quieter some nights than others. She had $42 in a room that wasn't hers, and a situation that had no name and no obvious trajectory. But she was not on a train back to Hartford, and every morning the mountains were there against the sky, closer than she'd expected, bigger than she could have imagined, and the air came in through the cracked open window, cold and clean, and entirely indifferent to her plans. She thought some mornings that this might be the beginning of something. She thought other mornings that she might be wrong about that. Either way, she got up and she went downstairs, and she made the coffee, and she started the day. November came in like it meant business. The first real snow fell on a Tuesday, overnight, and Evelyn woke to a world that had gone entirely white and quiet, in the way only snow-covered places could. A silence that wasn't empty but full, packed in around the house like insulation. She lay in the narrow bed for a moment listening to it, and then she got up and went downstairs because the fire wouldn't start itself. She had the stove going and the coffee on before she heard Wyatt's boots on the stairs. He came into the kitchen already dressed, coat on, hat in hand, and stopped when he saw the fire lit and the coffee ready in the way she'd noticed he sometimes stopped. Not with surprise exactly, more like a man adjusting to something he kept forgetting was going to be there. "Snow," she said unnecessarily. 6 inches, he said, maybe 8 by the creek. "Will the cattle be all right?" "They're range cattle. They've seen worse." He poured his coffee. "I'll check the near herd before it gets worse. Denny won't make it out from town in this. I'll manage the house. Thomas knows what to do in snow. He's grown up in it." He drank his coffee standing at the counter, looking out the window at the white yard. "There's extra wood in the back lean-to if you need it. The bin by the stove should last the morning." "I'll find it." He nodded and went out, and she heard the barn door and then nothing but the snow. Thomas came down an hour later wearing 2 sweaters and looking personally offended by the weather, which she found unreasonably endearing. "It's not even December," he said, standing at the window with his hands pressed to the glass. "Wyoming doesn't appear to operate on a schedule. Papa says it once snowed in September. That seems extreme. He said it killed half the apple tree." Thomas turned from the window. "Can we have eggs?" "You can have eggs if you go check whether the chickens survived the night." He went, without as much argument as she'd braced for, which told her something about the development of their particular dynamic over the past 3 weeks. He came back with 6 eggs and the report that the chickens were fine, but annoyed, which she thought was a reasonable response to 6 inches of unexpected snow. She made eggs. Thomas ate them and talked about the snow and what it meant for the ice on the creek, and whether the fox he'd been tracking would move to higher ground, and Evelyn drank her coffee and listened and asked the occasional question, and it occurred to her somewhere in the middle of it that this was the most ordinary morning she'd had in 2 years. Not dramatic, not precarious, not the particular low-grade anxiety of a woman managing a crisis one day at a time. Just ordinary. She turned back to the stove and didn't examine the feeling too closely, because she'd learned that examining good feelings too closely was a reliable way to make them stop. The snow lasted 3 days and brought with it a kind of enforced proximity that the ranch's usual routines had managed to avoid. With Denny snowbound in town and the work contracted to what 2 people and 1 8-year-old could manage, the days had a different texture. Wyatt in and out of the barn, Evelyn managing the house and the firewood and the cooking, Thomas oscillating between helpful and underfoot in roughly equal proportion. The kitchen table, which had been mostly a place where people ate at staggered hours and left again, became somewhere they actually sat at the same time, because the stove was the warmest spot in the house, and there was nowhere else reasonable to be. It was at the kitchen table, on the second snow day, that she and Wyatt had their first real argument. It started with the Caldwell account. She'd written the letter, Wyatt had sent it, and the response had come in the mail before the snow. A terse note from Caldwell's freight company suggesting the double billing had been a clerical error and offering to credit $12 against the next season's account, which was not $40 and was not what she'd asked for. She put the letter in front of Wyatt at the table. He read it. $12 is something, he said. $12 is not $40. Caldwell's been doing business in this county for 15 years. I have to work with him. You have to work with him honestly, she said. What he did wasn't a clerical error. A clerical error is charging the wrong rate once. Double billing your winter haul for 2 consecutive seasons is a decision. I know what it is. His voice had gone flat, which she'd come to understand was not the absence of feeling, but the management of it. But picking a fight with Caldwell over $28, it's not about $28, she said, and she kept her voice level because she'd learned that matching his flatness was more effective than getting heated. It's about whether he knows you'll notice. If you accept $12, he knows you won't push back, and next season it'll be something else. People like Caldwell, they don't stop because they feel guilty. They stop because it stops being worth it. People like Caldwell, he repeated. Something in his voice had changed slightly. You know a lot about people like Caldwell. She paused. Yes, she said. I do. He looked at her, and she saw the question forming and not being asked, which was characteristic of him. He had the particular restraint of a man who'd learned that asking too directly sometimes got you less than waiting. Victor Blackwell, she said, the man I told you about, who bought my father's firm. You said you lost your position. I did. She folded the Caldwell letter and set it square on the table. What I didn't fully explain in the letters is that my father built that firm over 30 years. Mercer and Associates had a solid reputation, good accounts, 4 employees. When he died 2 years ago, I became the managing bookkeeper because there was no one else. I ran it honestly for 8 months. She was keeping her voice factual, which was the only way to tell this story without it getting the better of her. Blackwell bought the debt on the building. The debt was manageable. We were meeting the payments, but he bought it specifically because he wanted the building and the client list. Then he called in the full balance with 30 days' notice, which was legal because of a clause in the original loan agreement that my father's lawyer apparently didn't read carefully enough. Why, it was still. I couldn't raise the money in 30 days, she said. Nobody could. So he took the firm, the building, the client accounts, all of it. He gave me 3 days to clear my desk. She looked at the Caldwell letter. He wasn't a clerical error either. He was a man who understood that if you get people desperate enough, they stop fighting back. I'm telling you, don't let Caldwell believe that about you. The kitchen was quiet except for the snow hitting the window and Thomas moving around in the room above them. Write a second letter, Wyatt said finally. Tell them the full 40, or we find another freight company come spring. We should say it by spring we expect to have documentation of the billing discrepancy submitted to the county commerce office, she said. That's more specific. He almost smiled. It wasn't quite a smile, more of a compression at one corner of his mouth that she was coming to recognize as the nearest equivalent. Do we actually have documentation? I have the ledger records for both seasons. That's documentation. She picked up the Caldwell letter and stood. I'll write the second letter this afternoon. Evelyn. She stopped. The man, he paused, choosing the words in the deliberate way he did. Blackwell. Is he the reason you left Hartford? One of them, she said. He took the firm. After that I'd been living in company lodgings, which I had to vacate. I found the boarding house. But Hartford was... She stopped, considered how much of this was useful to say. He has a long reach, Blackwell. He's not a small man. He buys things, and he holds them, and he doesn't like being left with unfinished business. She met Wyatt's eyes. I'm probably not done with him. I want you to know that. I'm probably not done with him, and he probably isn't done with me, and if you're going to have me here, you should know it. Wyatt looked at her for a long moment. All right, he said. All right, it doesn't bother you, or all right, you understand? Both, he said. He stood and took his cup to the sink, and she recognized this as his way of indicating a conversation had arrived at its conclusion. Write the letter, and Evelyn... He paused at the kitchen doorway. Thank you for telling me. She nodded. He went out. She sat at the table with the Caldwell letter for a moment, feeling something she didn't have a precise word for. Lighter, maybe, or something adjacent to lighter. The particular feeling of having put something down that you'd been carrying with your arms slightly bent, pretending it weighed less than it did. She wrote the letter. It was a very good letter. Thomas got sick at the end of the second snow week. Not seriously, not dangerously, just a child's winter cold that announced itself with a sore throat on a Thursday and escalated to a full, committed misery by Friday morning. He lay in bed with the particular reproachfulness of a sick child and refused to sleep and demanded water, and then didn't want the water and asked twice whether he was going to die, which Evelyn handled by telling him flatly that he was not, and which he seemed to find more reassuring than sympathy would have been. She spent most of Friday in and out of his room, bringing broth and weak tea, and twice reading to him from a battered collection of adventure stories she'd found on the shelf in the sitting room. He fell asleep during the second reading, finally, and she sat in the chair beside the bed for a few minutes, listening to his breathing even out before she went back downstairs. Wyatt was in the kitchen. He was standing by the stove with his coat still on, and he'd clearly just come in from the barn and hadn't taken his coat off because he'd heard her coming down the stairs and stopped. "He's asleep," she said. Something in his shoulders dropped slightly. "Not much. Enough." "How bad?" "It's a cold. He needs rest and fluids and to stop asking whether he's dying." She went to the stove to check the broth. "He's not good at being still." "No." A pause. "He gets that from—" He stopped. "He's not good at it." She didn't fill in the rest. She'd learned there were spaces in conversations with Wyatt that weren't gaps. They were part of the meaning, and filling them in was a kind of overwriting. "You should eat something," she said. "Sit down." "I'm not—" "Wyatt, sit down." He sat down. She put a bowl of stew in front of him, left over from the day before, reheated, better actually on the second day, and he ate it without comment while she cleaned up the kitchen around him, and it was one of those domestic arrangements that shouldn't have felt significant and somehow did. "You were up with him last night," Wyatt said. "He woke at 2. He couldn't sleep." "You don't have to—" "I know I don't have to." She turned from the sink. "He's 8 years old and he was scared and I was awake. It's not a complication." She looked at him. "Do you have trouble sleeping? In general, I mean, not just—" She stopped herself before completing the sentence the way she'd intended. He looked at her steadily. "You've heard me." "The kitchen is directly below my room," she said, not unkindly. I wasn't trying to notice. I just did." He was quiet. Not defensive. She'd half expected defensive. Just quiet, in the way a man was quiet when he was deciding how honest to be. 3 years, he said finally. "Since the accident. Most nights are fine. Sometimes they're not." He looked at the bowl. "I've gotten used to it." "That's not the same as it being fine." "No," he said. "It's not." She turned back to the sink and finished washing the bowl and the pot, and the kitchen had that particular quality of quiet that only existed between two people who'd just said something true to each other. "There's chamomile in the tin above the coffee," she said. "If it helps." "I'm not saying it will." "My mother used to make chamomile," he said. It didn't sound like a fond memory so much as a fact he'd located unexpectedly. "Mine too." She dried her hands. "Mine made it taste like grass clippings." Something happened at the corner of his mouth. "Mine wasn't much better." "There's a skill to it, apparently." She hung the towel. "I've gotten better. You're welcome to find out." He looked at her, and she thought for a moment he was going to deflect. He was good at deflection, at rerouting a conversation back to the practical when it got close to something personal. But he didn't. "All right," he said. She made the chamomile. They drank it at the table, and it was not a dramatic moment in any measurable way, and that was exactly the point of it. Denny came back when the road cleared, and with him came the routine of the ranch resuming its proper shape. Wyatt out early, Denny and his fence work, Thomas back at his lessons with the school books that arrived from the county schoolhouse, and occasional, irregular batches because the Red Creek schoolhouse had burned down 2 springs ago and hadn't been rebuilt yet, which was a source of ongoing civic frustration that Evelyn had learned about in some detail from Mrs. Alderman on the second Saturday trip to town. She had made something like a peace with Mrs. Alderman, not a warm peace. The woman had the specific quality of opinion that didn't update easily, but a functional one, built on the fact that Evelyn kept showing up at the general store, kept being pleasant, and kept demonstrating competence in the small, visible ways that small towns could register and recalibrate against. She'd mentioned the repair schedule to the right person, and word had gotten around that the Kane Ranch accounts were in order for the first time in years. She'd helped Mrs. Teller at the post office decipher a particularly garbled invoice from a catalog company, which had taken 15 minutes and earned a warmth that felt genuine. "You're managing them," Wyatt said one evening, with what she thought was equal parts observation and mild amusement. They were on the repaired porch after supper, a habit they'd fallen into on the evenings when it wasn't too cold. Wyatt with his coffee, Evelyn with her coat pulled tight, both of them watching the dark come in over the mountains. "I'm not managing them," she said. "I'm just not hiding." "There's a distinction. Hiding makes people curious," she said. "Being visible and boring makes people move on." He thought about this. "Is that what you did in Hartford before Blackwell made it impossible?" She looked at the mountains. "Somewhat. Women in accounting in Hartford are," she considered. "You become visible by being excellent, and then invisible by being consistent. If you're excellent every day, it stops being notable and starts being expected." She paused. "It didn't save the firm, but it bought me more time than a different approach would have." "You're not boring," he said. She looked at him. "Here," he said, "in town. You're not boring. People talk about you." "I know what they say. Not all of it is unkind." She turned this over. In the 3 weeks since the snow, she'd noticed the shift. Not in everyone, not in the people who'd made up their minds on the day she arrived on the platform and were unlikely to revise, but in others. In the way Holt at the feed store had started including her in the conversation when she came in with Wyatt, instead of addressing everything to him. In the way 2 of the younger women at the dry goods store had smiled at her last Saturday with something that looked like actual warmth. "Ellis the carpenter told Denny you saved the ranch," Wyatt said. "That's the version going around." "That's an exaggeration. The accounts were a mess," he said simply. "I know they were. I know you fixed it." He was looking at the dark, not at her. I don't say things I don't mean. I want you to know that." "I know that," she said. "What I mean is—" He stopped, started again. "I know this isn't what you planned, coming out here. I know it's not what the letters promised." "The letters promised honesty and a fair chance," she said. "I've had both." He was quiet for a moment. I'm not an easy man to—" "Wyatt!" She kept her voice gentle rather than sharp, because she could hear what the sentence was working toward, and she didn't need him to finish it. "I'm not asking you to be easy. I haven't been easy either. I showed up on a platform with $42 and a trunk and told a man I'd never met that I wasn't getting on a train back to nothing." She paused. "That's not easy. That's just stubborn." He made a sound that was almost a laugh. "Not quite. Close enough." Thomas appeared in the doorway behind them. He'd been told to go to bed 20 minutes ago and had clearly done approximately none of that. "It's cold out here," he observed. "Yes," Evelyn agreed, "which is why you should be inside in your bed." "I was thirsty." "The water pump is in the kitchen, which is inside." Thomas stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the 2 of them on the porch. Even in the low light, she could see the assessment in his expression. That particular calculation of a child trying to read adult situations with incomplete information. "Are you arguing?" he asked. "We were talking," Wyatt said. "It didn't sound like arguing." "Then why did you ask?" Thomas considered. "Sometimes people who aren't arguing look like they're arguing, and sometimes people who aren't arguing look like they're not arguing, but they are. Mrs. Alderman and Mr. Alderman always look like they're not arguing, but they always are." "Go to bed, Thomas," Wyatt said. Thomas went. They heard him all the way to the top of the stairs. "He watches everything," Evelyn said. "He always has." Wyatt's voice had a texture she was starting to recognize as the closest he got to affection. Not soft exactly, but worn smooth, like something handled often. Sarah used to say he was born 40 years old. It was the first time he'd volunteered a memory of Sarah, not in response to a question, not reluctantly coaxed out, just offered. She didn't make anything of it, she just let it sit where he'd put it. "She sounds like she knew him well," Evelyn said. "Better than anyone." He finished his coffee. "Better than I did, in some ways. I was working. I'm always working." He said it the way a man said something he'd said to himself many times, until it had the quality of a verdict. She was the one who talked to him, who knew what he was thinking. "He thinks about her," Evelyn said carefully. "I know he does. He talks to the horses about her. I overheard him once. It's all right." He looked at the cup in his hands. "What does he say?" She thought about whether to answer and decided honesty was worth the risk. "He tells them things he did during the day, like he's reporting in. She paused. He told the mayor about the fence post, I noticed. He said he thinks she would have liked you. Wyatt was very still. I'm sorry if that was, she started. No. His voice was rough at the edges. No, don't take it back. A pause. She would have. Sarah would have liked someone like you. She had no patience for soft. He said it with a kind of helpless accuracy, like it was exactly the word and he hadn't intended to find it. She would have said you were interesting. Evelyn looked at the mountains. That's a high compliment, she said. From her it was. He stood, and she could hear that whatever had just happened between them was going to be let alone now, that he was going to take it back inside with him and put it somewhere safe, which was what he did with things that mattered. Get inside. It's too cold for this. I know it is, she said. She didn't move immediately. Wyatt, he paused. Whatever this is, she said, gesturing between herself and the house and the ranch and all of it, I'm not going to wreck it. I don't want to wreck anything. I just want to... She stopped. I want to do good work. And I want Thomas to be all right. And I want the accounts to balance. That's all I want right now. You don't have to worry about the rest. He stood in the doorway for a moment with his back to her. I know, he said, and went inside. She sat on the porch for another 5 minutes, alone with the dark and the mountains and the cold that was not, she'd decided, actually unkind. Just honest, which was the same thing she'd said she wanted, and so it seemed only fair. The letter came on a Thursday in the 3rd week of November. Not from Caldwell. They'd received a response to the second letter that agreed, without warmth, to credit the full $40, which Evelyn had noted in the ledger with specific satisfaction. This letter came with a return address in Hartford, and it was not addressed to Wyatt. It was addressed to her. She knew the handwriting before she'd fully registered. She recognized it. She had processed enough of Victor Blackwell's correspondence in 8 months of managing the firm's accounts to know the particular weight and angle of his letters, written by a secretary, always, but in a style that was unmistakably Blackwell's in its precision. Neat, controlled, expensive paper. She stood in the cold by the mailbox at the road for a moment, the letter in her hand, and then she put it in her coat pocket and walked back to the house. She didn't open it immediately. She put it on the kitchen table and made coffee and went upstairs to get Thomas started on his lessons for the morning, and she came back down and drank half the coffee before she opened it. The letter was short, 3 paragraphs. The first informed her that Blackwell was aware of her current location. Not how, not who, just that he was aware, which was its own specific brand of menace, the kind that didn't need to explain itself because it was confident that not explaining was more frightening than explaining would be. The second paragraph said that he had outstanding questions regarding the disposition of certain client accounts from the Mercer firm that he believed she had information about. He used the word accounts, the way men like him used words, to mean things that sounded legal and bureaucratic but contained threats in the subtext like blades in a length of silk. The third paragraph said he hoped she was well and was certain she would be willing to assist in resolving these matters in a manner that worked for everyone involved. She put the letter down and looked at it for a long time. There were no outstanding account questions. There was nothing legitimate in the letter at all. She'd been a meticulous bookkeeper for 8 years. She had kept copies of everything she could carry when she left the firm, because she'd known, even in the shock of those 3 days, that copies might matter someday. There was nothing Blackwell could legitimately claim she owed him. What he wanted, she understood, reading the letter again and reading the spaces between the sentences, was for her to know that distance hadn't made her safe, that she hadn't, in his accounting of things, finished being useful to him. She heard the back door and then Wyatt's boots in the mudroom. She thought about folding the letter back in its envelope and putting it somewhere private and not saying anything. She thought about this seriously for almost 30 seconds. And then she remembered the conversation on the porch. I want you to know. And she left the letter on the table. Wyatt came into the kitchen, saw it, saw her face, and stopped. What is that? He said. A letter from Victor Blackwell. She picked up her coffee. He knows I'm here. He crossed to the table and picked up the letter and read it. She watched his face, which didn't do much but do things she was learning to read. The slight tightening at the corner of his eye that meant controlled anger. the stillness that meant he was working through something. "He found you," Wyatt said. "He found me." She set the cup down. "He has resources. I knew he might eventually. I had hoped. I had thought if I went far enough, fast enough, he might not think I was worth the effort." She paused. "I appear to have underestimated his opinion of his own interests." Wyatt set the letter back on the table. He was quiet for a moment. "What does he actually want?" "Control," she said. "It's not the accounts. He has the accounts. He has everything from the firm. What he—" She stopped. This was the part she hadn't fully articulated even to herself, and articulating it now felt like pressing on a bruise. He doesn't like things he can't account for, people who leave before he's finished with them. It bothers him in the specific way that it bothered him when clients left for another firm. It's not about the money. It's about the fact that leaving implies he was something worth leaving. Wyatt looked at her. "He's not going to stop at a letter," she said, because she believed it, and it seemed worse to not say it. "This is men like Blackwell. This is a first letter. It means he's thought about it and decided I'm worth the attention. The next one will be less polite." "Or it won't be a letter," Wyatt said. "Yes," she said, "or it won't be a letter." The kitchen sat very still around them. Somewhere upstairs, Thomas was moving around, the sound of his feet on the floor above, doing whatever 8-year-old lesson avoidance looked like on a given Thursday. "I can write to the sheriff in Hartford," she said. "I have records of the firm acquisition. I kept copies of everything. There may be grounds to—" "Can you prove anything?" "Probably not enough. Not yet." She'd thought about this over the past 2 years in the methodical way she thought about financial discrepancies, tracing everything back to its source. He's very careful. He does things that are just barely legal, which is different from legal but requires documentation and witnesses and someone with standing to push. "You have standing." "I have the standing of a woman without a firm or a position or a family name," she said, more bluntly than she'd intended. "Which is not the kind of standing that tends to move things in Hartford courts." Wyatt was quiet. "What I'm saying," she said, "is that I don't know what he's going to do. And I think you should know that. I think—" She met his eyes. "I think if you want me to find somewhere else to—" "No," he said, flat and without hesitation in a way that was unusual for him. She stopped. "No," he said again, more quietly. "You're not—" He looked at the letter. "This is a letter. He doesn't know what he's dealing with. Not yet." She looked at him, at the jaw that had been carved rather than grown, and the eyes that were very dark in the kitchen light, and she thought that he meant something more specific than reassurance, that there was a layer beneath the words that was something closer to a statement of position. "Wyatt." "Write to the Hartford sheriff," he said. "Document what you have. I know a man in Laramie, a lawyer, a good one, who handles land and property disputes. He's dealt with men like this before." He picked up the Blackwell letter, folded it precisely, and put it in his own coat pocket. "And we'll keep our eyes open." She looked at the pocket where the letter had gone. "You don't have to do this," she said. "I know I don't have to." He went to pour himself coffee. "You'd tell me the same thing." She thought about the porch, about "I want to do good work, and I want Thomas to be all right," and she thought he'd been listening more carefully to that than she'd known. "I would," she said. "Then there you go," he said, and drank his coffee. Outside the kitchen window, the November sky sat low and gray and close, and somewhere in the distance the mountains were still there, invisible behind the cloud but present, the way things that mattered were present even when you couldn't see them. Upstairs, Thomas gave up on his lessons and came to the top of the stairs. "Can I come down?" he called. "Have you finished the arithmetic?" Evelyn called back. A pause. "Most of it." "What does most mean?" Another pause, more calculating. "The parts that weren't hard." "Come down when you've done the hard parts," she said. A groan, theatrical and total, and then the sound of feet retreating. Wyatt looked at her. "He does the same thing with the barn work," he said. "Finishes the parts that aren't hard." "He's 8, she said. "So do most adults, if we're honest." Something crossed his face again. Not quite a smile. Not quite not one. "I'll go right to the sheriff," she said. "And I'll need paper." "Third drawer," he said, "left side of the desk." She went to write the letter. And if her hands weren't entirely steady when she uncapped the pen, she didn't make anything of it, because steadiness was something you did with your posture and your voice and the direction you faced, even when your hands weren't cooperating. The mountains were still out there behind the clouds. She'd seen them enough now to know they didn't move for weather. Neither, she decided, was she going to. The second letter from Blackwell arrived on a Monday in early December, and it was, as Evelyn had predicted, less polite. It was also longer. 4 paragraphs this time, on the same expensive paper, in the same precise hand, but the subtext had shifted from suggestion to something closer to instruction. He referenced specific documents from the Mercer firm acquisition. He referenced a conversation between Evelyn and a client named Hargrove that had taken place 8 months before the firm was sold, a conversation she remembered exactly, because she'd known even then that something was being constructed around her that she didn't fully understand yet. He used the word irregularities, which was the kind of word that could mean almost anything when wielded by a man with enough money to define his own terms. She read it twice at the kitchen table, alone, before Wyatt came in. Then she put it with the first letter in the wooden box she'd begun keeping in the back of her desk drawer, alongside the copies of the Mercer firm documents she'd brought with her from Hartford, the billing records, the client correspondence, the original loan agreement with its particular clause circled in pencil by her own hand the day she'd finally found it and understood what it meant. The box was getting heavier. "Another one?" Wyatt said when he came in. He could read her face now, which she hadn't entirely expected but had stopped being surprised by. "More specific this time," she said. "He's building something. I don't know what yet, but he's being methodical about it." "Has the Laramie lawyer responded?" "Last week. He says the acquisition documents I have are useful but not sufficient to bring a fraud claim without additional evidence of intent." She'd read that letter several times too, working out exactly what Wyatt's contact, a man named Aldous Reed, who wrote with the compressed clarity of someone who charged by the word, was telling her between the lines. He says if Blackwell makes a move that can be documented, a direct threat, an attempt to interfere with my employment or residence, that changes the picture. "So we wait for him to do something worse," Wyatt said. "Essentially." He poured his coffee and stood at the counter. "I don't like waiting for something to get worse before you can stop it." "Neither do I," she said, "but that's the situation." He drank his coffee and didn't say what he was thinking, which she'd come to understand was not evasion, but a kind of respect. He thought before he spoke, and he didn't speak until he had something worth saying. She'd started to appreciate this in proportion to how rarely she'd encountered it. "I told Denny," he said. She looked up. "About Blackwell?" "That there might be trouble coming, that he should keep his eyes open." He set the cup down. "He's a good man. He won't talk." She nodded. "Thank you." "I also mentioned it to the sheriff." She hadn't expected that. "Our sheriff, Briggs? He's a decent man. Not much crime out here, mostly cattle disputes and the occasional drunk. But he's not stupid, and he's not in anyone's pocket." Wyatt met her eyes. "He can't do much without cause, but if something happens, he'll already know the context." She was quiet for a moment. She was thinking about how alone she'd felt in the Hartford boarding house, trying to work out how to fight a man like Blackwell with $42 and a box of documents and no one who had any particular stake in the outcome. She was thinking about the difference between that and this. "Wyatt," she said. "Don't," he said, not unkindly. "I was just going to say thank you." "I know what you were going to say." He picked up his hat. "It doesn't need to be said." He went out. She sat at the table for a moment, and then she went back to the accounts, because the accounts were something she could control, and she was a woman who'd learned that control over small things was how you survived the uncontrollable ones. December deepened, and the ranch settled into its winter rhythm, and for 3 weeks after the second letter, nothing happened. No third letter, no strangers on the road, no particular shadows at the edge of the ordinary. Evelyn was not reassured by this. She knew enough about the way men like Blackwell operated to understand that silence was not the same as withdrawal. Silence was preparation. But life had its own insistence, and it did not pause for anticipation. Thomas had his 9th birthday on the 14th of December. Evelyn had known it was coming because she'd found the date in a letter from the county school superintendent that was filed incorrectly in the ranch correspondence. And she'd said nothing to Wyatt, but she'd spent 3 evenings after Thomas was in bed making a set of maps, detailed ones, of the ranch and the surrounding land, with the creek and the fox's likely territory marked the way Thomas talked about that animal with the specific fervor of a child who decided it was personally significant. She'd used ink and the best paper from Wyatt's desk and her own drafting skills, which were substantial from years of keeping property ledgers that required accurate site diagrams. She had left the rolled maps on the kitchen table with a piece of blue ribbon around them. The same ribbon that had held her own letters together, the one that had faded from blue to something closer to gray, which felt appropriate in a way she didn't examine too closely. Thomas came downstairs in the morning, saw the maps, and didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he unrolled them carefully on the table and looked at each one with the total absorption of a child receiving exactly the right thing, the kind of gift that confirmed someone had been paying attention. "You put the den here," he said, pointing to a spot near the East Creek bend. "That's where you said it was," she said, "in October, when you were tracking the mud prints." He looked at the map for another moment. "It's good," he said, which was the Kane family version of effusive. Wyatt came in from the barn and saw the map spread on the table and his son standing over them with a straightness in his posture that the slumped, cold morning version of Thomas rarely achieved. He looked at Evelyn. She was making breakfast and didn't make anything of the look. "Happy birthday," Wyatt said to Thomas, and ruffled his hair in the unself-conscious way parents did when they weren't thinking about the gesture, just doing it. Thomas smoothed his hair down. "Did you know about these?" "No," Wyatt said. "She made them herself. They're accurate." "I heard," Wyatt said. She served the eggs and didn't turn around. That evening, Wyatt came home from a trip to town. He'd gone for feed and a few other things, not unusual, with a package from the general store that turned out to contain a compass. A good one, with a brass case and clean markings, the kind of instrument you bought when you meant for it to last. Thomas received it with the same stillness he'd received the maps, and then spent the rest of the evening matching it to the ranch map with an intensity that was nearly religious. She and Wyatt were washing up the supper things, a task that had evolved without discussion into something they did together on the evenings Denny wasn't there, one washing and one drying, which was efficient, and also, she'd noticed, one of the times they talked most easily. And she said, "That was a good thing, the compass." "Maps aren't much use without one," he said. "No," she agreed. "They're not." He dried the last bowl and set it on the shelf, and they stood in the kitchen with the quiet sounds of Thomas and his compass in the next room, and Wyatt said, not looking at her, "Sarah would have made something like that, the maps. She was good at, she paid attention to what he cared about." Evelyn put the wash basin back under the counter. "You pay attention too," she said. "The compass proves it." He didn't answer, which she'd learned was sometimes more than an answer. "What?" The men arrived on the 19th of December, 3 days before what would have been, if anyone at the ranch had been counting, Evelyn's 9th week at Kane's Crossing. She saw them first. She was coming back from the near pasture where she'd gone to check the water trough, which had a tendency to ice over in the mornings and needed braking before the cattle pushed each other trying to get to the clear center. She had the iron bar they kept for the purpose over her shoulder, and she was halfway between the pasture gate and the house when she saw the 2 horses on the road. They were moving slowly, deliberately, the way riders moved when they were looking at something, not going somewhere. Both men wore trail coats and low hat brims and the particular posture of men accustomed to being paid for physical outcomes. She stood at the pasture gate and watched them until they cleared the bend in the road and were out of sight. Then she went directly to the barn. Wyatt was working on a piece of harness in the back. He heard her come in and looked up and read whatever was on her face. "What?" he said. 2 men on the road, moving slowly, looking at the property. She kept her voice even. "I don't recognize them." He set the harness down. Description: trail coats dark. 1 a bay horse, 1 gray. Both men mid-30s, I'd estimate. The one on the gray had the way he sat the saddle. She stopped. "Men ride differently when they're working," she said. He sat the saddle like it was work. Wyatt was already moving toward the barn door. "Where's Thomas?" In the house. He was at his lessons when I went out. Keep him in the house. He was looking down the road, which was empty now, pale winter light on frozen mud. Go back inside and stay there. I'm going to get Denny. Denny's in town. I'll send word with Ellis. He was already heading for the wagon. Evelyn? He turned back, and there was something in his face she hadn't seen before. Not fear, but the sharp, organizing quality of a man who'd moved past the possibility of trouble and into the management of it. Lock the front door. My rifle's above the kitchen fireplace. You know how to use one? She'd been on the frontier for 2 months. I've learned, she said. Something shifted in his face that wasn't quite relief. Good. He started the wagon horse. I'll be an hour. He was back in 40 minutes with Denny, who arrived with his own rifle, and the specific quiet of a man who didn't waste words when there was actual work to be done. Ellis the carpenter had also apparently been found because he appeared at the ranch gate on horseback an hour after Denny, with what appeared to be a hunting rifle and the expression of a man who'd made a decision and wasn't second-guessing it. Word gets around, Denny said when he saw Ellis. He was at the feed store, Wyatt said, and didn't elaborate. They did not see the two riders again that day. Wyatt did a perimeter check of the ranch on horseback before dark, and Denny sat on the porch for the better part of the afternoon in the cold with the calm patience of a man who'd learned how to wait for things. And Thomas stayed inside and asked twice what was happening, and was told both times that everything was fine in a tone that satisfied him less than it was intended to. That night, after Thomas was in bed, Evelyn sat at the kitchen table and told Wyatt what she believed the two men were. Not speculators, not travelers, not county men of any legitimate variety. She told him what she'd told him 2 weeks ago, more specifically this time, that Blackwell's reach was long, that he employed people whose usefulness depended on their willingness to operate at the edges of what was legal, and that if he'd sent men to Red Creek, it meant he'd shifted from letters to action. He's done this before, she said, in Hartford. A man named Corley, who had a debt to the Mercer firm that Blackwell acquired. When Corley wouldn't cooperate with the account transfer, 2 men visited his business 3 nights running. They didn't do anything, just stood outside. The 3rd night, someone broke Corley's window. She folded her hands on the table. He signed the account transfer the next day. Wyatt was very still. He's testing, she said, seeing whether the sight of them is enough. It's not, Wyatt said. I know that. You know that. She met his eyes. He doesn't know that yet. He was quiet for a long moment. Does he know about the documents you have? He suspects I kept copies of something. He doesn't know what. She thought about the letter with its careful references to irregularities in client accounts. He's fishing. He wants to know what I have before he decides how to move. So we don't tell him. No, she agreed. We don't. Outside the kitchen window, the December dark was total. No moon, thick cloud cover, the kind of night that hid everything equally. Denny had gone home, but he was coming back in the morning, and Ellis had offered to come again if needed, and the sheriff in town had been told. These were all good things, and Evelyn counted them against the weight of the thing that was building at the edge of the ranch's ordinary life, and tried to determine whether they were enough. She wasn't certain they were. The next 8 days had the texture of a held breath. She went into town with Wyatt on Saturday, which she continued to do because stopping would have been visible in the way that hiding was visible, and she'd lived by the rule that you didn't give men like Blackwell the satisfaction of watching you shrink. She was pleasant at the general store, and she spoke to the sheriff herself, Briggs, a solid man in his 50s with no particular interest in drama, which she found appropriate. And she mentioned the riders on the road with the same factual tone she'd have used to report a fence post. He wrote it down and told her he'd keep an eye. She did not mention that on Wednesday evening she'd seen the same bay horse tied outside the Red Creek Saloon, and that she'd told Wyatt, and that Wyatt had gone in and found a man matching her description of the bay's rider sitting alone at a corner table nursing a drink and watching the door. Wyatt had sat down across from him. She got this account from Denny, who had been there, who told her about it later with the economy of a man reporting facts. Your boss sent you a long way, Wyatt had said, apparently. The man had said he didn't know what Wyatt was talking about. That's all right, Wyatt had said. You can tell him the answer is no. You can also tell him that the woman he's looking for has friends out here, and that friends out here are different from friends in Hartford. The man had left town the next morning. The gray horse left with him. Evelyn, when Denny told her this, was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He's going to take that as information. He'll know I told someone and that the someone wasn't scared off." "That's what Wyatt figured," Denny said without inflection. "So the next move won't be two men on a road." "No," Denny said. "Probably not." She thanked him and went back to the accounts and worked for 2 hours without looking up, because the accounts were something she could control, and she was running low on things she could control. Victor Blackwell arrived on the 22nd of December, 9 days before the year turned. He did not arrive with 2 men. He arrived with 6, in 2 wagons and on horseback, and he arrived at midday when the light was flat and the cold had no drama in it, just endurance. He arrived like a man who'd done his arithmetic and was satisfied with the result. Evelyn saw the wagons from the kitchen window. She knew immediately. She didn't need to see his face. She recognized the quality of the arrival, the deliberate pace of men who hadn't come to negotiate. "Thomas," she said very calmly. Thomas was at the kitchen table with his compass and the ranch maps. "Go to your room. Take the maps with you. Don't come downstairs until your father or I come to get you." Thomas looked at the window, then at her face. He was 9 years old and not stupid. "Who are they?" "People I need to talk to. Go upstairs." He went. She heard him take the stairs 2 at a time, which was reassuring. He understood something was wrong without understanding what, and he was following instructions, which was exactly right. She went to the fireplace in the kitchen and took down the rifle. It was loaded. She checked it anyway because checking was a habit she'd developed in the past 3 weeks, and habits were worth keeping. She heard the door from the barn. Wyatt had seen them too. He came into the kitchen and saw the rifle in her hands and the wagon through the window and said nothing for a moment. 6 men, she said. I counted. He went to his own coat and took out the revolver he'd started keeping there since the riders on the road. Denny's in the far pasture. I sent the boy for him before I came in. She meant Thomas. She told him to go upstairs. I told Thomas to stay upstairs. I know, I sent one of Ellis's boys. He was helping with the fence posts. He was at the window now looking out. Blackwell's in the lead wagon. She hadn't seen the man in 2 years. She came to the window and looked, and there he was, smaller than she remembered, which was often how men were when you saw them from a distance, when the particular gravity of their proximity wasn't present to inflate them. He was perhaps 55, well-dressed even for travel, with a face that was composed and unremarkable and gave nothing of his intentions away because he'd had 55 years to practice not giving things away. He brought more men than he needed for a conversation, Wyatt said. He always does. She stepped back from the window. He brought more than he needed for a conversation because he's not interested in a conversation. Wyatt looked at her. What's he interested in? Demonstration. She set the rifle against the wall within reach and straightened her coat, which was a reflexive gesture she barely noticed. He wants me to see the size of what he brought and decide it's not worth fighting. That's his preference. It saves him complications. What if you don't decide that? Then he'll do whatever he came here to do anyway, but he'll consider the extra trouble a personal affront. She looked at Wyatt. He's not a man who accepts being told no. I told you that. You did. He checked the revolver one more time. Stay behind me when we go out. I'll do no such thing. Evelyn, he came here for me, she said. If I'm behind you, he'll think I'm afraid of him, and men like Blackwell recalibrate when they think they've already won. She met his eyes. Stand beside me. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was somewhere between objection and something else she couldn't fully name, and then he said, all right, and opened the front door. The cold hit them both when they stepped onto the porch, and Blackwell's wagons had stopped at the yard gate, and the 6 men with him had arranged themselves in the particular way of men deployed rather than traveling, some on horseback, some on foot, positioned at angles that were not casual. Blackwell descended from the wagon with the careful ease of a man who'd planned exactly how this scene would look. He was wearing a good coat, dark gray, and he carried no visible weapon, which was its own kind of statement. Miss Mercer, he said. He had a pleasant voice. He'd always had a pleasant voice. You've come a long way. Mr. Blackwell, she said. Her voice came out even, which she was grateful for. I don't remember inviting you. We had unfinished business, he said. He looked at Wyatt with the brief, assessing glance of a man pricing something. "You must be Kane." "I must be," Wyatt said. "I apologize for the interruption to your day." The apology contained no apology in it whatsoever. "I have some matters to discuss with Miss Mercer. It won't take long." "Discuss them here," Wyatt said. Blackwell smiled. It was a perfectly constructed smile. "The matters are somewhat private. Nothing is private on this porch that she doesn't want to be," Wyatt said. "Say what you came to say." Something shifted in Blackwell's face. Barely visible, barely anything, but Evelyn had watched that face across a desk for months and she saw it. The slight recalculation. He hadn't expected Wyatt to be immovable on this point. He'd expected a man who'd step back from a dispute that wasn't his. He didn't know Wyatt Kane. "Miss Mercer," Blackwell said, turning the full attention of his pleasant voice back to her. "I have documentation suggesting that certain records from the Mercer firm acquisition were removed without authorization. I'm prepared to be generous in resolving this. Return what you took, confirm the details I need confirmed, and we go our separate ways." "I didn't take anything that wasn't mine," she said. "I have my own correspondence with clients and my own working records. Nothing that belonged to the firm after you acquired it. The firm's records became mine upon acquisition. That includes all correspondence generated by firm employees during the course of their employment." "That's a creative interpretation of the acquisition agreement," she said. "I'd be interested to see which clause you're citing." The smile went a fraction less pleasant. "I didn't come here to debate clauses." "Then why did you bring 6 men?" Wyatt said. Blackwell looked at him again, longer this time. "Ranch work requires help," he said pleasantly. "These men aren't dressed for ranch work," Wyatt said. A silence settled over the yard. One of the horses moved and jingled its tack and went still again. From somewhere past the barn, Evelyn heard a sound that might have been Denny approaching through the field. "Mr. Kane," Blackwell said, "this is a matter between myself and a former employee. I understand she's made herself useful to you, and I appreciate you've taken her situation in. But it would be a mistake to let someone else's complications become your own." "Seems like they already are," Wyatt said. "They don't have to be." Blackwell's voice was still pleasant, still controlled, and underneath the control was the pressure of a man who was accustomed to people eventually understanding what he was actually saying and adjusting accordingly. "Miss Mercer, you're an intelligent woman. You've always been. You know how this ends. There are ways this can end well for everyone, and ways it can end considerably less well. I'm offering you the former." She looked at him across the frozen yard. This man who had taken her father's firm with a clause and a smile, and the absolute confidence that the world arranged itself for people who applied sufficient pressure. And she thought about the boarding house kitchen, and the letter that had felt like a window opening, and the 1,000 miles of prairie, and the narrow bed, and the ledgers and the coffee left at just the right temperature, and the maps with the blue ribbon. And she thought about what she'd told Wyatt on the porch. "I don't need things to be easy. I need them to be real." "No?" she said. Blackwell blinked, just slightly. "No," she said again. "I'm not giving you anything. I'm not confirming anything. I'm not going anywhere with you, and I would like you to leave this property." The yard was very still. "Miss Mercer." "She said no," Wyatt said. His voice had not changed in volume or tone. It was the same, even unambiguous voice he'd used to say, "Nothing is private on this porch." But there was something beneath it now that hadn't been there before. Something that had the quality of a man who'd made a decision and closed the door on reconsideration. Blackwell looked between them. The calculation behind his eyes was visible to Evelyn, even if it wouldn't have been to anyone else. She'd watched him calculate too many times. He was reassessing the variables. 6 men against 2, but one of the 2 was a woman with a rifle visible in the doorway behind her, and the other was a man who didn't appear to understand how the arithmetic was supposed to make him behave. "I know what happened to Sarah Kane," Blackwell said. The yard went from still to silent. It was a thing said to cause maximum damage, and it worked the way a thing like that worked. Not because of what it meant, but because of the fact of it being said, the fact of Blackwell's knowing it, the sudden exposure of how much he'd researched, how far back he'd gone, how deliberately he'd prepared this particular instrument. Evelyn looked at Wyatt. His face had done something she'd never seen it do. Not anger, not exactly anger, something colder, something that had gone very deep, very fast, like a stone dropped in dark water. "What?" Wyatt said, and the word came out stripped of everything except its own weight. Blackwell's tone shifted slightly, and it was no longer entirely pleasant. "The accident, 3 years ago. The accounts I acquired included freight and transport records going back some years. I have documentation that suggests the incident wasn't entirely—" "What documentation?" Wyatt said. And this was the thing that Evelyn understood in the moment Blackwell said it, and understood with the specific clarity of a woman who'd spent 8 years reading accounts and finding the truths hidden in numbers. Blackwell had documentation. He'd researched the accident. He hadn't pulled this from nothing. He'd found something, or found someone who'd told him something, and he'd brought it here like a key to a lock he'd identified in advance. But he'd made a mistake. He'd thought it would lock Wyatt down. He'd thought it would work the way pressure worked on people who were trying to protect something. Make them small, make them cooperative, make them calculate whether fighting back was worth what it might cost. He didn't know that he had just handed Wyatt Kane the thing he'd been unable to find for 3 years. "I want to see it," Wyatt said. His voice was terrifyingly calm. "Whatever documentation you have about my wife's death, I want to see it." Blackwell hadn't expected that. Evelyn saw it in his face before he recovered, the half-second where the calculation went wrong and he had to find a new footing. "That's not—" "You came onto my property and told me you have documentation about how my wife died." Wyatt had come down the porch steps without Evelyn fully registering he'd moved. He was in the yard now, and he was not a small man, and 3 years of running 400 acres alone had left nothing soft about him. "You're going to tell me what that documentation says and where you got it, or this conversation ends in a way you won't prefer." "Kane, you also need to understand," Wyatt said, and his voice had gone very quiet in the way that things went quiet right before something broke. "That I know the names of every man on this property, and every man on this property has been seen by my ranch hand and by 2 other men from town who are on their way here right now. Sheriff Briggs has your name. My lawyer in Laramie has your name. Whatever you came here to do, your name is attached to it." Blackwell was still. For the first time since he'd arrived, the pleasant, managed quality of his expression had something behind it that looked very much like the recalculation of a man who'd walked into a room he hadn't fully surveyed. From beyond the barn came the sound of horses, not 2, but several, and Evelyn turned to see Denny coming through the gate on horseback, and behind him Ellis. And behind Ellis were 2 more men she recognized from town, men who'd been in the feed store on Saturday, men who'd nodded at her and at Wyatt with the brief, acknowledging nod of people who'd made up their minds about something. The yard had changed its arithmetic. One of Blackwell's men shifted in his saddle. Another glanced toward the road. The man on the bay horse, the one who'd left town after Wyatt spoke to him in the saloon, was looking at Wyatt with an expression that was not as confident as it had been on the road 2 weeks ago. "Mr. Blackwell," Evelyn said. She'd come down the porch steps now, too. She had the rifle. She was not pointing it at anyone, just holding it, which was sometimes the most significant thing about a rifle. "You said there are ways this can end well for everyone. I'd like to take you up on that." He looked at her. "You show us what you have about Sarah Kane," she said, "right now. And then you explain how you came to have it." She kept her voice level and she kept her eyes on him, and she did not look away. "Because if what you have shows that her death was something other than an accident, then what you're actually holding is evidence of a crime. And evidence of a crime belongs with the sheriff." She paused. "So either you show it to us and it matters, or you don't show it because you made it up. In which case you've just threatened a man with fabricated information about his dead wife on his own property in front of witnesses." She let that sit. "Which version would you prefer?" The yard was completely silent. Victor Blackwell looked at Evelyn Mercer and at Wyatt Kane beside her, and at the men coming through the gate, and at the sheriff's deputy who had apparently also materialized at some point on the road. She saw him now, recognizing his horse, and she watched the man recalculate for the last time. He reached into his coat. 3 of the men from town raised their rifles. Blackwell stopped, then moved very slowly and produced a folded document. "My man on the bay can bring it," Evelyn said. "Set it in his saddlebag and step back." Blackwell did it. The bay's rider brought it to Wyatt, who unfolded it and read it. Evelyn watched Wyatt read it. She watched his face change as he read it. Change in the way faces changed when something that had been formless and terrible for 3 years suddenly acquired a shape that was worse than formless, but was at least a shape, something you could look at directly, something that had a who and a when and a therefore. He read it twice. His hands were entirely steady. "This is a freight company ledger," he said. His voice came from somewhere very deep. "This is a record of payment to a man named Daly." He looked up at Blackwell. "Daly worked for you?" Blackwell said nothing. "He worked the freight route between Laramie and Red Creek 3 years ago," Wyatt said. It wasn't a question. "He was on the Lander Road the day my wife's horse threw her." He folded the document. His hands were still steady, but his voice had changed quality, was carrying something now that hadn't been there before, something with weight and edges. "You paid a man who was on the road the day my wife died. This ledger shows payment for a job in March 3 years ago. Her accident was in March." "That doesn't establish," Blackwell started. "No," Wyatt said. "It doesn't. Not by itself." He looked at the document. "But it's a place to start." He looked at Evelyn. She understood what he was asking without him asking it. She turned to the deputy on the road. "Deputy Marsh," she said, because she'd made it her business to know his name, "I believe there's material here relevant to an investigation. I'd like you to take Mr. Blackwell's name and have him explain to Sheriff Briggs how he came to be in possession of freight records related to an incident in your county 3 years ago." Deputy Marsh had the expression of a man who'd come expecting trouble and found something more complicated. He rode forward. Blackwell looked at Evelyn. For the first time since his arrival, the pleasant management of his face was entirely gone. And what was underneath it was the face of a man who'd lost the thread of a plan that had seemed very solid 2 hours ago. "This isn't finished," he said. "No," she agreed. "It isn't." She held his gaze and she did not look away. And after a moment he looked at the deputy and the men from town and Denny on his horse and Ellis with his rifle, and she watched him calculate the final time. The way he'd calculated her father's debt and the clause in the loan agreement and the window broken in Corley's business. And she watched him find, for perhaps the first time in a very long career of finding advantages, that the numbers didn't come out in his favor. He said something to his men. They began to move toward the gate. It was not a defeat, not yet. She knew that. Wyatt knew it. The deputy with his notepad and his careful questions knew it. But it was something. It was the shape of the thing, finally visible, with edges you could press against and a direction you could push. Deputy Marsh rode alongside Blackwell's wagon down the road toward town, his horse steady and unhurried, and Evelyn stood in the yard of Kane's Crossing and watched them go. Beside her, Wyatt was still holding the folded document. She didn't say anything. This was not a moment for words, not her words anyway. This was a moment that belonged to him, to what he just had handed to him without warning, not resolution, not yet, but the possibility of it. The first solid ground after 3 years of not knowing, which was its own kind of terrible gift. After a while he said quietly, "His name was Daly." "Yes," she said. "I need to find Daly." "I know." She stood beside him in the cold. "We will." Denny had dismounted and Ellis was talking to the men from town, and somewhere upstairs in the house a 9-year-old boy was waiting to be told he could come down, and the December sky sat flat and gray over all of it. Over the yard and the barn and the repaired porch railings and the mountains invisible behind the clouds, and the ranch stood exactly as it had that morning, somewhat battered and entirely intact. Sheriff Briggs kept Victor Blackwell in Red Creek for 2 days. He couldn't hold him longer than that. Blackwell had a lawyer in Laramie who arrived by the second morning with the particular efficiency of a man who'd been paid well to be available on short notice. And the legal ground for detention was, as Briggs told Wyatt with the candor of a man who didn't believe in false comfort, thin. The freight ledger was suggestive. Suggestive was not sufficient, but Briggs was thorough, and he was not, as Evelyn had assessed him, in anyone's pocket. He took a full statement from Wyatt about the day of Sarah's accident, the road, the timing, who had been where, and he sent a telegraph to the Laramie County Sheriff about a man named Daly who had worked the freight route 3 years ago. He documented Blackwell's arrival at Kane's Crossing, the number of men he'd brought, the nature of what was said, with Deputy Marsh's account as corroboration. "It's not nothing," Briggs told them both, in his office on the morning Blackwell's lawyer got him released. "But it's not enough yet. I need Daly." So do I, Wyatt said. Let me find him, Briggs said. That's my job. You go home. Wyatt did not look like a man who found going home an easy instruction to follow, but he went. Quote, the days between Christmas and the New Year had a particular quality at Kane's Crossing that year. Not celebratory exactly, but not anxious either. Something in between, the way weather felt in the hour before it decided what it was going to do. Thomas had been told, carefully and in pieces, what had happened in the yard on the 22nd. Wyatt had told him himself, sitting in the barn with the boy on the hay bale where he apparently did some of his more significant talking, and Evelyn had not been there for it. She'd given them the space deliberately and stayed in the kitchen making bread she didn't strictly need to make, listening to the shape of the quiet from outside. Thomas came in afterward and sat at the kitchen table and was quiet for a while. She put a piece of bread in front of him. The first loaf was out, still warm, and sat across from him and waited. Papa thinks someone made Mama's horse throw her, Thomas said finally. He said it the way he'd learned to say hard things, factually, as if the facts were something he could hold at a slight distance. It's possible, she said. We don't know yet. But that man, Blackwell, he had papers about it. He had a record of paying someone who was on the road that day. That's not the same as knowing what happened. She kept her voice even. It's the beginning of finding out, not the end. Thomas pulled a piece off the bread and didn't eat it. Papa's been thinking it was his fault, he said. For 3 years. He thinks he should have been with her. She'd understood this without being told. She'd understood it from the footsteps in the kitchen at 2 a.m, and the way he'd said I was working, I'm always working, and the particular quality of how he carried Sarah Kane's memory, not with tenderness exactly, but with the weight of a man who'd added blame to grief and let them fuse together. Yes, she said. I think so. Is it his fault? No, she said. It isn't. She said it without hesitation because it was true, and because Thomas needed to hear it said without qualification. What happened to your mother was not your father's fault. Whatever we find out about that day, that part is true. Thomas was quiet for a moment. How do you know? But because I've watched your father run this ranch for 2 months, she said. He works hard and he takes care of what he's responsible for. That's not a man who neglects the people he loves. That's just a man who was somewhere else when something terrible happened, and those are different things. He turned this over in the careful way he turned things over. You think he'll believe that? When you tell him? I think, she said, that believing it is his job, not mine. I can say it. Whether it lands is up to him. Thomas nodded slowly, as if he'd received a piece of information he needed to file correctly. Then he ate the bread. Well, she told Wyatt that night. Not all of it. Not Thomas's version of the conversation, but her own version, which was essentially the same truth arrived at from a different direction. They were on the porch again, because the porch had become where they said the things that didn't fit inside. It was cold enough that their breath made small clouds, and she had her coat and her scarf, and still felt the cold in her fingers, but she didn't go in. Whatever that ledger shows, she said, it changes the what. It doesn't change anything you did or didn't do. He was looking at the dark. I know that. I'm not sure you do, she said. Not the way you need to. He was quiet. I've watched you for 2 months, she said. I've watched you carry something that goes past grief. Grief I understand. This is grief with an extra weight on top of it. She turned to look at his profile. You've been running this ranch like you're paying a debt. The silence lasted long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. She wanted to go to town that day, he said. His voice had the quality of something surfacing from a long way down. I said I needed to check the south fence line. I said she should go without me. He stopped. I was in the far field when Denny came to find me. I'd been there 2 hours. Wyatt, I know what you're going to say. I don't think you do, she said. I'm going to say that if a man named Daly put something in the road or spooked that horse deliberately or did whatever it is Blackwell paid him to do that day, then the only person responsible for Sarah's death is the man who gave the order and the man who carried it out, not the man in the south field. She didn't soften her voice. She kept it the same level it always was because softness sometimes made people feel the speaker wasn't sure. You've been carrying the wrong debt for 3 years. He put his hands on the porch railing. His knuckles went pale. She was a good woman, he said. Came out ragged, the way things came out when they'd been pressed down too long and finally found an exit. She was better than this place deserved, better than I. He stopped, pressed his hands harder on the railing. She let it sit. She did not try to answer it, because some things didn't need an answer, they needed room. After a while he straightened and let out a long breath into the cold. I need Daly to be found, he said. His voice had come back to its regular register. I need to know what actually happened. Briggs will find him, she said. He's a thorough man. And if the answer is worse than what I've been imagining, she thought about this honestly. Then it's a different weight, she said, but it's the real one. And real weights you can put somewhere. The ones you made up yourself are the ones that go everywhere with you. He looked at her for a long moment in the dark. You're very direct, he said. I've been told. I mean it as... He paused. I mean it well. She nodded. They went inside. Briggs found Daly in the second week of January in a town called Mineral Fork, 60 miles north of Red Creek, working freight for a different company under a name that was almost but not quite his own. The kind of change a man made when he wasn't hiding hard, just hoping distance would do the work. It didn't. Briggs brought him in himself, and he brought him to Laramie rather than Red Creek, because what Daly had to say, once he understood the full shape of what he was facing, required the county sheriff and a recorder and a lawyer present. And what he said was enough. Not all of it was what Wyatt had feared. The part that was worst, the part about what Daly had been paid to do that day on the Lander Road, was also the part that resolved 3 years of imagined guilt into something with a different shape entirely. Sarah Kane's horse had been startled deliberately by a sound device Daly had placed near the road, intended to cause a stumble, intended to injure, not kill. The killing had been accident within the crime, which was not a distinction that made the crime smaller, but was a distinction that mattered for what came next. What came next was Daly naming Blackwell. He named him specifically, with dates and amounts, and the name of Blackwell's intermediary who had hired him, because Daly was a man who'd lived for 3 years with the knowledge of what he'd done and found it considerably heavier than he'd expected. And when Briggs explained the alternative to cooperation, Daly decided cooperation was worth what it cost. Wyatt was in Laramie for the statement. Evelyn stayed at the ranch with Thomas. He was gone 3 days. She ran the ranch. She and Denny managed the cattle check, and the firewood, and the cooking, and Thomas's lessons, and the morning and the evening. And she did it without making anything of the doing, without performing the competence of it, just doing what needed doing, because that was what you did. Thomas, on the second day, asked her if she was scared. About what? She said. They were at the kitchen table. He was doing arithmetic. About what they're going to find out. About what happens to Blackwell. He looked up from the paper. About what happens after. She thought about answering this the practical way, about what the legal process would likely involve, about what Reed the Laramie lawyer had outlined as the probable outcomes. Then she thought that wasn't what he was asking. A little, she said. Not about the legal part, about the after. What's the after? She set her pen down. Your father and I made a practical arrangement, she said. That's what it started as. I came here with nowhere else to go, and he let me stay because he needed what I could do. That's honest. But it's been 3 months now, and... She stopped. I don't know what comes after. That's what I'm uncertain about. Thomas looked at her with those eyes that were still slightly too large for his face, the eyes of a child who'd learned early to read rooms and had gotten very good at it. Papa doesn't want you to leave, he said. She was careful. Did he say that? He doesn't say things like that, Thomas said, with the accuracy of someone who had 9 years of data on the subject. But I can tell. He talks differently since you came. He talks more. He went back to the arithmetic. And he sleeps better. I stopped hearing him in the kitchen at night. She picked up her pen and didn't say anything for a moment. Finish the arithmetic, she said finally. He finished the arithmetic. Wyatt came back on the third day in the late afternoon when the light was going orange and flat across the snow. She heard the wagon and went to the window and then went back to the stove, because she was a woman who'd learned not to make entrances, and what he needed when he walked in the door was probably not to find her waiting with the particular tension of 3 days' worth of questions. He came in through the back. She heard him in the mudroom, the coat and the boots, and then he appeared in the kitchen doorway. He looked tired, not devastated. She'd thought about what devastated would look like on him and had prepared for it, but tired in the deep way of a man who'd sat with something difficult for 3 days and had come through to the other side of it. "Coffee's hot," she said. "Good." He came and poured it and sat at the table, which he didn't always do immediately. Usually he stood at the counter. She noted the sitting as information. She put a bowl of soup in front of him without being asked and went back to the stove. Daly gave a full statement, he said, after a minute. Named Blackwell and the intermediary. Briggs has it all. The Laramie sheriff is filing charges, fraud, conspiracy, and something the lawyer called criminal endangerment. He drank the coffee. Reed says Blackwell will try to buy his way to a lighter outcome. He usually can. But Reed also says this particular combination of witnesses and documentation makes buying his way out considerably more expensive than he'll have anticipated. She turned from the stove. Will it be enough? For Blackwell to face real consequences? Maybe. He said it without bitterness, which she found, in its way, more significant than anger would have been. Probably not everything he deserves. Men like him rarely get everything they deserve. But Reed says the fraud charges from the Mercer acquisition, the ones built from your documents, those are the strongest part. That's where they have the clearest paper trail. She turned back to the stove and adjusted something that didn't need adjusting. Your documents, he said. The ones you carried from Hartford. Yes. Reed says they're the foundation of the fraud case. I kept everything, she said. 8 years of meticulous records. I knew there was something wrong with the acquisition, even at the time. I didn't know enough to name it, but I kept everything because I thought I might need it someday. She paused. My father taught me that. He said the one thing you could never let someone take from you was the record of what actually happened. He was quiet for a moment. Smart man. He was. She set the spoon down. He would have fought Blackwell better than I did. He had standing and a name and 30 years of reputation in the city. I had $42 and a copy of every document I could carry. She turned around. It turned out to be enough. Wyatt looked at her across the kitchen. The late light was coming through the west window at a low angle, the kind of winter afternoon light that made everything specific. The grain of the table, the lines around his eyes, the particular stillness of a man who'd put something down that he'd been carrying too long and was getting used to the absence of the weight. He paid someone to frighten her horse, Wyatt said. He wasn't trying to kill her. Daly said the instruction was to cause an injury, something that would keep us, occupied, distracted. He looked at the coffee cup. He'd been trying to buy land in this county for 2 years. The Kane property was one of several he had his eye on. The plan, Daly thinks, was to create difficulty for the ranch, medical bills, distraction, financial pressure, and then make an offer on the land when we were vulnerable. His jaw tightened. She died because a horse that was startled badly on a road with a rock shoulder stumbled wrong. He stopped. That's not what he paid for, Evelyn said. But it's what happened. Yes. He pressed his hands flat on the table. For 3 years I thought it was an accident. Then for the past 3 weeks I thought it was murder. The truth is somewhere in between, which is its own kind of... He didn't finish the sentence. Terrible, she said. Yes, but it wasn't my fault, he said. He said it carefully, as if he were checking whether the words held weight. Choosing to work instead of going with her. That wasn't... No, she said. It wasn't. He nodded slowly. Not the nod of a man who'd just been convinced of something. The nod of a man who'd already known it, somewhere beneath the guilt, and was now hearing it confirmed from outside himself in a way that made it real in a different register. Thomas appeared in the doorway. He'd been upstairs with his maps. She'd heard him moving around while she cooked. And he stood in the kitchen entrance in his too big coat, looking at his father with the direct, uncomplicated attention of a child who didn't know how to pretend he hadn't been waiting. You're back, Thomas said. I'm back, Wyatt said. Thomas crossed the kitchen and sat in his chair and picked up his fork from where he'd left it at lunch, because he was 9 years old and hungry, and also, Evelyn suspected, because sitting down at the table was the way he'd learned to say, I'm glad you're here, without having to say it. Is it done? Thomas asked. Not all of it, Wyatt said, but the main part. Thomas considered this. Is he going to come back? The man from Hartford? No, Wyatt said. He said it with the specific flatness of a decision that had already been made. He's not. Thomas seemed satisfied with that. He ate. Evelyn served the soup and sat down herself because there were 3 people in this kitchen and the soup was hot and the light was going and the ranch had made it through intact, and some moments didn't need to be anything more than what they were. The weeks that followed moved differently than the weeks before. Not easier, necessarily. There was still the legal process, the back and forth with Reed and Laramie, the periodic updates from Briggs about the progress of the case against Blackwell, which moved with the particular deliberate pace of legal proceedings involving men with money and lawyers who were paid to slow things down. There were still mornings when Wyatt came in from the barn with the expression of a man working through something he hadn't finished working through. There were still nights when the old grief had a different quality than before. Not lighter, but differently shaped, the way an injury felt different once you understood how it had happened. But there were also other things. There was the morning in mid-January when Ellis came by with 2 of his men and spent the day repairing the upper window frame properly. The one that had been covered with oilcloth since before Evelyn arrived, and did it without being asked and without billing for the labor, which he explained by saying only that people helped each other out here, which was not a full explanation but was enough. There was the afternoon Mrs. Alderman came to the ranch, actually came, in her good coat, with a pie, and sat at the kitchen table and said nothing about what had happened on the platform in October or in the yard in December, but talked about the pie and the weather, and asked whether Thomas was keeping up with his letters since the schoolhouse was still not rebuilt. There was Denny, who appeared on a Monday morning with a new fence post driver and no explanation, and got to work on the east pasture post that had been sunk shallow since November. You don't have to, Evelyn started. I'm here 3 days a week, Denny said, without looking up from the post. Might as well be useful. There was Thomas, who had started doing a thing she noticed first in February, leaving his arithmetic on the kitchen table in the morning before she came down, completed, including the hard parts, with occasional notes in the margin where he'd made errors and corrected them himself. She never mentioned it. Neither did he. But she always checked the work and left it back where he'd put it, and once, when he'd done something particularly careful with a long division problem, she left a small mark at the top of the page. Not a grade, just a line, the kind of mark she'd put in ledgers when something balanced correctly. He found it and said nothing, but the next day's work was neater, and there was Wyatt. There was the evening in late January when she'd been trying to fix the stuck pump handle in the cold. The ice had gotten into the mechanism again, which happened every time the temperature dropped below a certain point, and he'd come up behind her and said, "Here," and reached past her and applied pressure to a specific part of the handle she hadn't tried, and the pump came unstuck, and he didn't move away immediately. And she was very aware of the few inches of cold air between them and the fact that she'd stopped working. "There's a trick to it," he said. His voice was close. "I see that," she said. "I should have shown you earlier. It only happens when it's very cold." Still, he stepped back, which was a decision she could hear in the quality of the air between them. "You should know how." "Show me again," she said. "So I remember." He showed her, his hand over hers on the handle, demonstrating the angle of pressure. It lasted perhaps 15 seconds. Neither of them made anything of it. They went back inside. But she thought about it that night, in the way you thought about small things that weren't small. She thought about it, and then she thought about what Thomas had said. He talks more. And she thought about what Wyatt had said months ago on the porch, that he was not given to easy words, but he believed in plain truth. She thought about what she'd said she wanted. Not a promise, a chance. She wasn't sure yet what the chance had become. She was sure it was something, and she was sure it was real, and she'd said from the beginning that real was what mattered. The formal charges against Victor Blackwell were filed in Laramie County on the 14th of February. Reed sent a letter with the details, and Evelyn read it at the kitchen table and then passed it to Wyatt and watched him read it. The charges covered the Mercer firm acquisition, 3 specific counts of fraudulent contract manipulation, which Reed explained had been built almost entirely from the documents Evelyn had carried from Hartford. They covered a separate count related to the intimidation campaign against Corley, the man whose window had been broken, who had apparently been found and was now willing to give a statement. And they covered 1 count related to the incident on the Lander Road, which was the most complex legally and the one Reed was least certain about, but which was on the record. Blackwell would not go to prison, Reed thought. His lawyers were too good and his money too available, but the fraud charges would cost him significantly, in fines, in reputation, in the specific attention of other lawyers who handled other cases, and who now had Blackwell's name attached to a documented pattern. Men like Blackwell, Reed wrote in his dry, compressed way, were often stopped not by one decisive blow, but by accumulation, by the weight of documented history becoming too heavy to move through.
"Is it enough?" Thomas asked. He'd been allowed to listen. Evelyn thought about this. For the law, probably close to what the law can manage, she said. For what he actually deserves? No, probably not. She looked at Wyatt. That's generally how it works. Reed seems satisfied, Wyatt said. Reed is practical, she said. He knows what the system can do, and he got it to do most of that. That's worth something.
Wyatt folded the letter. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said something she hadn't expected. I'd like to tell Thomas about Sarah, he said. The real things. Not just that she died. Not just the accident. I mean, he paused. Who she was. What she was like before. He looked at Thomas, then back at the table. I stopped talking about her because it was... He stopped. I should have kept talking about her. Thomas had gone very still. I know, he said, in a voice that came from somewhere small and careful. I know you stopped. I'm sorry, Wyatt said. He said it the way he said things he meant, directly, without ornamentation. I'm sorry for that. Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, She used to smell like the soap from the blue tin, the one that's still in the bathroom. I never use it. Wyatt looked at his son. Something crossed his face that Evelyn had never seen there before. Not grief exactly, because grief she'd seen. Something past grief. Something that was grief used up to its end and what was on the other side of it. She bought it in Laramie, he said, every time we went. She said the Red Creek store bought the wrong kind. Thomas almost smiled. She was picky about soap. She was picky about a lot of things, Wyatt said. She was picky about fence lines. She said mine were always slightly crooked. Were they? Yes, Wyatt said. They were. Thomas did smile then, small and real, the specific smile of a child hearing a story about a person who'd been reduced to a memory and is suddenly three-dimensional again. Evelyn was at the counter. She turned back to what she was doing and let the two of them have it, this conversation that had been waiting 3 years to happen, and she thought about her father and the records he'd told her to keep, and the plain truth that Wyatt had said he believed in, and she thought that plain truth was sometimes the most expensive thing a person offered and the most necessary. Outside the kitchen window, the February light was sharper than January's, with something almost like warmth in it on the south-facing side of the barn, which meant spring was still a long way off but was no longer entirely theoretical. The mountains were visible today, clear and white, and exactly as they'd been every day she'd been here and every day before she arrived. She thought, for the first time with something that felt like certainty rather than hope, that she was going to be here to see them in summer. That she was going to see what this valley looked like when the grass came back and the creek ran clear and the apple tree put out whatever it could manage after the snow that had killed half of it years ago. She was going to be here, going to be. That felt in the quiet kitchen with the soup heating on the stove, and a father and son talking about soap from a blue tin, like the most significant thing she'd thought all year. Spring came to the valley the way it always did in Wyoming. Not gently, not all at once, but in arguments. A warm week in March that melted the top layer of snow and turned the yard to mud, followed by a hard frost that locked everything again, followed by rain that couldn't decide whether it wanted to be sleet. The mountains ran with snowmelt that made the creek loud for the first time since Evelyn had arrived, and the sound of it, persistent, purposeful, entirely indifferent to the chaos around it, became the background of her mornings in a way she found, without quite intending to, comforting. She was in the near pasture checking the east fence posts, the ones Denny had reset in January, which she wanted to verify had held through the freeze-thaw cycles, when Wyatt found her. She heard his boots on the hard ground behind her and didn't turn around immediately because she'd gotten used to the particular sound of his approach. And there was nothing alarming in it. Third post from the corner, she said, without turning. It's holding, but the ground around it is soft, worth watching when the melt gets serious. He came and stood beside her and looked at the post. I see it. Denny said it well. It might be fine.
It might. He looked at the post for another moment, then at the mountains, which were doing something extraordinary in the morning light. The snowpack on the upper ridges catching the sun at an angle that made them look like they were lit from inside rather than above. He looked at them the way she'd noticed he sometimes did, not like a man admiring scenery, but like a man checking in with something that had been there longer than he had and would be there after.
I want to ask you something, he said. She turned then. His face was doing the thing she'd never fully learned to predict. The particular internal arrangement of a man who'd decided on a course of action and was committing to it with the same determined practicality he brought to fence posts and cattle accounts. All right, she said. He didn't look away. She'd noticed in the months she'd known him that he never looked away when he was saying something he meant. The looking away was for the things he was still working out. The direct look was for the things he'd finished. I'd like you to stay, he said. Not the way it's been. Not the arrangement. I mean permanently. I mean as my wife. He paused. That's what I'm asking. The fence post stood solid in the soft ground beside them. The creek was loud somewhere past the tree line. A hawk was doing something unhurried in the sky above the south pasture. She looked at him for a moment. You're not asking because you need the accounts balanced, she said. No, he said. Or because Thomas needs someone. Thomas needs you, he said. But that's not why I'm asking. He set his jaw slightly, the way he did when he was making himself continue past the point where continuing was comfortable. I'm asking because these past 5 months have been the first time since Sarah died that the ranch has felt like something worth fighting for rather than just something I'm obligated to keep. And I know that's not a romantic thing to say. I know it's not. It's honest, she said. It's honest, he agreed. That's what I can offer you. That and the ranch and Thomas, and this valley that's cold 10 months of the year, and the fence posts are always doing something inconvenient. Something shifted in his face. I'm not easy. You know that better than most. I do, she said. And you're not easy either, he said, and it came out with the particular warmth that his voice carried when he wasn't trying to carry it. You came in here and reorganized everything and argued with me about Caldwell and wrote letters to people and told me things I needed to hear in the way I needed to hear them, and you didn't ask my permission for any of it. He paused. I didn't know I needed that. I know it now. She looked at the man in front of her, at the jaw and the dark eyes and the gray coming in at his temples and the hands that had held the ledger she'd organized, and the Blackwell document and a cup of chamomile that tasted better than his mother's had. She'd made sure of it. She looked at him, and she thought about Hartford and $42 and a platform in October and the particular cold of being entirely alone in a situation you didn't choose. She thought about what it meant to choose. Yes, she said. He let out a breath. Just slightly. Just enough. Yes, she said again, because it was worth saying twice. I'll stay. He nodded. He put out his hand, which was so characteristically him, this handshake instinct in a moment that most men would have handled differently, and she looked at his hand and then she stepped forward instead and put her arms around him, because she had not gotten this far by waiting for someone else to do the necessary thing first. He was still for a moment, the way he was still when things surprised him. Then his arms came around her, and he was solid and warm and smelled like the barn and cold air and coffee, and they stood in the east pasture with the soft ground under them and the mountains above. And it was not a perfect moment. The mud was real and the fence post was still a concern, and there were legal proceedings still running in Laramie that would require attention, and the apple tree had only half its branches, and the house still needed work on the back lean-to roof. None of that was the point. The point was the standing there, both of them imperfect and present, choosing the same thing at the same time. Thomas is going to say he knew, she said into his coat. She felt the sound he made. Not quite a laugh, almost. He did know, Wyatt said. He's been insufferable about it for 2 months. She pulled back and looked at him. You talked to him first. I had some questions about what I was going to say. The corner of his mouth did the thing it did. He's better with words than I am in certain situations. She laughed. It came out real and a little surprised, the way laughing did when it arrived ahead of your intention, and his expression did something she hadn't seen before. Something open and uncomplicated.
the look of a man who hadn't heard that sound enough and had just been reminded it existed.
"Come on," she said. "The post will hold." They walked back to the house together through the mud and the morning, and neither of them said anything, and the creek ran loud behind them all the way. Thomas was in the kitchen. He was at the table with his compass and the ranch maps, which was where he was most mornings. But he'd been there long enough, and in the particular stillness of someone who was pretending to be absorbed in what they were doing and was not remotely absorbed in it. He looked up when they came in. He looked at Evelyn's face and then at his father's, and he was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. "I told him the part about not being romantic enough," Thomas said. "You did a fine job," Evelyn said. "He practiced twice." "Thomas," Wyatt said, "I'm just saying it wasn't all him." Thomas looked back at his compass with the elaborate unconcern of a child who had won something and was being dignified about it. Then he looked up again, and the dignified quality dropped, and what was underneath it was 9 years old and earnest and slightly terrified by its own hope. "Are you going to stay? Really stay?" "Really stay," she said. He looked at the compass. He pressed his lips together in the way he did when he was managing something larger than he wanted to show. "Okay," he said. His voice was steady. His ears had gone red. "Good. He swallowed. "That's good." Wyatt put his hand on the back of Thomas's head, briefly, the same gesture as the birthday morning, entirely unselfconscious. Thomas didn't smooth his hair down this time. Evelyn went to start the coffee, because some moments needed something practical happening in them to make them bearable, and the coffee was what she knew how to do. And doing it meant she could face the stove for a minute while she put her face in order. She thought about her father, who had built a firm for 30 years and taught her that records were what remained when everything else was taken. She thought about what he would have made of this kitchen, and this man, and this boy, and this valley. She thought he would have said he was not a sentimental man, but he was a precise one. He would have said that she had done a good job of keeping the record of what actually happened, and that the record had turned out to contain more than she'd thought she was carrying. She pressed her hands flat on the counter for a moment. Then she made the coffee and poured 3 cups, because Thomas had recently decided he was old enough for coffee with enough milk in it to make the point theoretical, and she had decided not to argue about it. They were married in April, when the mud had dried enough to make the road to town passable, and the apple tree had put out a hesitant row of blossoms on the branches that had survived. Not many, but enough to make the point that it was still trying. The ceremony was at the Red Creek Courthouse, which was a modest building that served simultaneously as town hall, sheriff's office waiting room, an occasional venue for public meetings about the schoolhouse that still hadn't been rebuilt. It held, on a Wednesday afternoon in the 3rd week of April, Wyatt and Evelyn, Thomas in his good coat that fit him slightly better than it had in October because he'd grown, Denny in a clean shirt that suggested significant effort, Ellis the carpenter with his wife, Deputy Marsh, Sheriff Briggs, the Holts from the feed store, and Mrs. Alderman, who had evolved, by some process that neither party had fully tracked, from the woman who'd been blank-faced in the general store in October to someone who'd brought a pie in January and was now standing in the courthouse in her best dress, with an expression that suggested she intended to take some credit for the outcome. The justice of the peace was a man named Carroll, who did this perhaps 6 times a year and had the practiced efficiency of someone who understood that ceremonies mattered not because of their length, but because of the words in them. The words were short, they were plain, they were true. Evelyn said them with her hands steady and her voice steady and Wyatt's eyes on hers, and Wyatt said them with the directness he brought to everything he meant. And Thomas stood beside his father and held the ring when it was needed and did not drop it, which he had been worried about, she knew, because he'd practiced with his compass case for 3 days. Afterward, there was food at the general store. Mrs. Alderman had organized this, which was itself a statement about how comprehensively the woman had revised her position. And people came and shook hands and said the things people said at these occasions. And Evelyn stood in the middle of it and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time and couldn't name immediately, and then could. She felt known. Not perfectly known. There was no such thing, and she had no interest in a life so small it could be perfectly known. But known in the way that mattered, by people who'd watched her carry something difficult and had decided she was worth the knowing. Denny shook her hand and said, "Good." That was all. It was enough. Ellis said, "Let me know when you're ready to fix the lean-to roof. Spring rate." She said she would, and she meant it. Mrs. Alderman held her hand for a moment and said, "You've been good for him," in a tone that was half observation and half apology, and Evelyn said, "He's been good for me," because it was true and because it closed the accounting fairly. Thomas ate an amount of food that suggested he hadn't eaten in several days, which was how he ate at occasions he was happy about, and he talked to Deputy Marsh for 20 minutes about fox tracking and cartography. And at one point, Evelyn caught him looking at her across the room with the expression of a child who was trying to contain something too large for his face, and she raised an eyebrow at him, and he raised one back, and they left it at that. Summer arrived the way springs promised it would, sudden and total, and the valley was a different thing in summer than in winter. Different in the way that you knew intellectually that a landscape could transform and still weren't entirely prepared for the transformation. The grass came back thick and green along the creek, and the mountains lost their snow down to the high elevations and showed their real geography, and the apple tree produced, against all reasonable expectation given its condition, a modest but genuine crop of apples in August that Thomas picked with the focus of a person completing important work. The accounts were in better shape than they'd been in 4 years. The operating loan from Laramie had been restructured at a lower rate. The Caldwell freight situation had been resolved with a different company altogether, and the cattle season had been solid enough that Reed, when they paid his final bill, had noted with his compressed satisfaction that the ranch's financial position was, in his assessment, stable. Daly had received a sentence of 18 months in the county prison in Laramie, reduced for cooperation. It was not enough, considered plainly, for what he'd done, but it was on the record, and on the record was where things needed to be. Blackwell had settled the fraud charges out of court, which Reed had anticipated, and the settlement was significant enough that Reed called it a meaningful outcome, with the particular understatement of a lawyer who'd gotten more than he'd expected and didn't want to oversell it. 2 of Blackwell's other legal matters, brought by people who'd been watching how the Mercer case unfolded and had decided the time was right to bring their own documentation forward, were pending in Hartford courts. Men like Blackwell were not stopped by one thing. They were stopped by accumulation, exactly as Reed had said, by the weight of documented history becoming too heavy to move through. Evelyn kept the wooden box in the back of the desk drawer. She didn't need it anymore for the immediate purpose, but she kept it. Her father had taught her that records were what remained when everything else was taken, and she had no intention of unlearning that lesson just because the crisis had passed. She thought about this one evening in late August, sitting on the porch with Wyatt in the last of the light. Thomas was somewhere with his maps and his compass, probably along the creek where he'd told her last week he thought the fox had moved its den for the summer. The mountains were purple in the dusk, a color that seemed too theatrical to be real but was entirely real. And the valley was making the particular sounds it made in summer evenings, insects and water, and the occasional distant sound from the cattle, and the kind of quiet that wasn't empty. "I've been thinking about the schoolhouse," she said. Wyatt looked at her. "The one that burned. The one that hasn't been rebuilt because there's been no one to organize the funding and coordinate the lumber order and write the necessary letters to the county education office." She looked at the mountains. "I've been making some notes." He was quiet for a moment. "You've been making notes about rebuilding the Red Creek schoolhouse. Somebody has to. Thomas can't travel to Laramie for lessons indefinitely, and there are 12 other children in this county with the same problem." She paused. "I've spoken to Ellis. He thinks the construction is manageable with 4 men and the right lumber order. The county has a fund for public buildings that apparently nobody has formally applied to since the fire, because nobody knew how to file the application. The application is not complicated," she said. "It requires documentation of the building's public function, estimated construction costs, and a letter from 3 property owners in the county confirming the need." She looked at him. "I have 2 letters already. I thought you might be willing to write the 3rd. He looked at her with the expression she'd come to know as the one he wore when she'd done something he hadn't seen coming and wasn't entirely surprised by. "You've been planning this for how long?" "Since February," she said. It seemed premature to mention before everything else was settled. He was quiet. "The valley needs a schoolhouse," she said. "Children need to learn to read and reason and keep records and think. That doesn't happen on its own." She looked at the apple tree, visible at the corner of the house, laden with the modest and unreasonable apples of its partial recovery. "I spent 2 years thinking the most important thing I'd lost was the firm. The building, the clients, the accounts. But the real thing my father gave me wasn't any of that. It was 18 years of watching someone do honest work and care about whether it was done right. She paused. That's what a schoolhouse is. Somebody has to build it. Wyatt was looking at the mountains now, too. I'll write the letter, he said. I know you will. She leaned back in the porch chair. I'll have the application ready by Thursday. He made the sound that was almost a laugh. What? She said. Nothing, he said. You. She turned to look at him, and he was looking at her with the open expression she'd first seen in the pasture in March, the one that she'd decided was his version of something other men showed more easily, something that in him went deep rather than wide. Me, she agreed. Thomas found the fox den in September, which he reported at the supper table with the focused intensity of a significant discovery. He'd marked it on the map and noted the direction of the entrance and estimated, based on what he'd read in one of the Laramie library books Evelyn had ordered for him, that it was likely a family group rather than a solitary animal. There were 3 sets of tracks, he said, 2 adult sizes and 1 smaller. Probably this season's kit that hasn't dispersed yet. You didn't disturb them, Evelyn said. I was very quiet, he said. I stayed upwind. She looked at him across the table. This boy who was nearly 10 now and had grown 2 inches since October and still had the 2 large eyes and still talked to the horses. She could hear him through the barn wall when the morning was quiet enough. This boy who had written 9 letters in a forged hand because he'd been paying attention to what his father needed and had decided, with the specific courage of a 9-year-old running out of better options, to do something about it. She thought sometimes about what it had cost him, not the guilt of having deceived someone. He'd faced that on the platform, and he'd been facing it since. In the particular way, he worked harder than he had to and made sure the arithmetic was done, including the hard parts. What it had cost him was something prior to that. The admission, even to himself, that things were not all right, that his father was walking the kitchen at 2 in the morning and needed someone, that the house had something missing in it that he didn't know how to name and couldn't fix himself. It took a specific kind of bravery to see that clearly and act on it, even badly, maybe especially badly. Bad actions from right instincts were how most of the real things in the world got done. Good, she said. Keep watching them. Draw what you observe. I know, he said. I'm already drawing. He showed her after supper. A page of careful observations, the tracks mapped to scale, a sketch of the den entrance with its surrounding ground markers. The sketch was better than she'd expected. The proportions were right, and the detail was precise in the way his cartography was always precise, the way his mind worked when it was given something concrete to hold. Thomas, she said. He looked up. You're going to need a better education than I can give you at the kitchen table, she said. The schoolhouse should be ready by spring, but after that, after a few years of that, there are programs. In Laramie, and further, for young people who are good at observation and documentation and thinking precisely about what they observe. She set the sketch down. I want you to know that's available to you. Whatever it costs, whatever it requires, that's available. He looked at her for a moment. Papa too? He said. We've discussed it, she said. Which was true. She'd raised it with Wyatt on the porch in August, and he'd said, with the compression of a man who didn't need long sentences for large things, that whatever Thomas needed was what Thomas would have, and that Evelyn would know better than he did what that looked like. Thomas nodded slowly. He picked up the sketch and rolled it carefully and put it in the tube he kept his maps in. He did this with the specific reverence of a person who understood that certain things should be kept. Evelyn, he said. Yes. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the tube in his hands. I know it worked out, the letters, but I know it was wrong. I know you know, she said. I just wanted to... He stopped. I wanted to say I'm sorry, properly, not like the platform. He looked up. You came all that way, and it wasn't what you thought. She looked at this boy who'd written 9 letters and practiced a forged signature for 2 weeks, and had stood on the platform without running and had left stones and feathers on the kitchen table and done the hard parts of the arithmetic and named a fox family in the East Creek Bend. Thomas, she said, I came all that way, and it was better than what I thought. She said it plainly, because he deserved plain truth the same as his father did. The thing I thought I was going to, I would have been all right. I would have made it work. That's what I know how to do. She paused. But this is not just all right. This is... She looked at the kitchen, at the ledgers on the shelf and the maps on the wall, and the coffee tin, and the windowsill, with the stone and the feather still on it. This is real. That's rarer than all right. He thought about this seriously, the way he thought about things he intended to keep. Okay, he said. Good. Good, she agreed. He went to bed, and she heard him on the stairs, and the house settled into its evening sounds around her. There's a thing that happens to people who survive hard years, and it is this. You forget slowly that you were surviving. Not all at once, not cleanly, but the survival mind, which is always half-braced, always counting the exits, always running the arithmetic of how bad things could get. That mind loosens its grip degree by degree, and one morning you pour the coffee and look out the window at the mountains, and you realize you are not braced for anything. You are just there, in the morning, with the coffee and the mountains. Evelyn had been braced for most of her adult life. She'd been braced in the firm, keeping her work excellent and her presence invisible, waiting for the thing she couldn't see to arrive from the direction she wasn't watching. She'd been braced in the boarding house with her $42 and her box of documents. She'd been braced on the train west and on the platform, and in the first weeks at Kane's Crossing, when every morning required a specific act of will just to be there. She didn't stop being careful. That wasn't in her nature, and she had no interest in changing her nature. She kept the records, and she paid attention, and she wrote the letters that needed writing, and she watched the fence posts, and she did not trust good periods to be permanent just because they were good. But the bracing loosened, and in the loosening was something she recognized with some surprise as ordinary happiness, not the dramatic kind, not the kind that arrived with violins and resolution, but the daily kind, the kind made of coffee and mud, and a boy's maps on the wall and a man's hand over hers demonstrating a pump mechanism and the sound of the creek in the morning telling you the world was still doing what it was supposed to do. It is a thing worth saying because it is not obvious, and the world does not always say it plainly. Survival is not the same as living. Surviving is what you do when the options are limited and the margin is thin, and you get up every morning because the alternative is worse. Living is what happens when you are somewhere real, with people who know you, doing work that matters. And the morning is just the morning, without the weight of what might be coming attached to it. Evelyn Mercer. Evelyn Kane. Now, though she kept Mercer in the documents because her father had built something with that name and it deserved to be kept, had survived for 2 years in Hartford and lived for the year in Red Creek, and she knew the difference the way you knew it in the body, in the quality of the breath, in whether the morning felt like something to get through or something to be in. She was in it. Finally, fully, in the ordinary, extraordinary dailiness of it. The schoolhouse was completed the following April, 12 months after the courthouse wedding, built with county funds and Ellis's crew and the lumber order she'd managed and the letters she'd written to the 3 families who'd been sending their children 40 miles each way. There were 19 children on the first day, ranging from 6 to 13, and the teacher was a young woman named Pruitt, who'd come down from Casper and who Evelyn had interviewed herself at Reed's office because someone had to, and who had the specific quality of not being frightened of noise or questions or the particular chaos of children learning things they didn't know yet. Thomas sat in the 3rd row on the first day because he was not a front row person by nature and had been told by Evelyn that the back row was for people who'd already decided they knew more than the teacher, which he had diplomatically declined to dispute. She stood at the back of the room and watched the class begin, and she thought about her father, who had believed in records and honest work and the plain truth of a situation faced directly. She thought about what it meant to build something, and whether you could know, while you were building it, that it mattered, or whether you only found that out later when you saw what it held. She thought you found it out later. She thought that was probably right and probably necessary, that the building had to happen without the guarantee, which was what made the building mean something. Outside the schoolhouse window, the April sky was doing something complicated, and Wyoming over the mountains, half cloud and half blue, and the snowmelt running the creek loud in the distance. The mountains were there. They were always there. She went home to the ranch, to the accounts, and the afternoon, and whatever Wyatt needed looking at on the south fence line, and the road was mud in the low spots and good in the high ones, and the apple tree was blossoming again at the corner of the house. More branches this year, better coverage, not fully recovered but moving in that direction, the way living things moved when they were given enough time and not asked to be more than they were. She drove past it and stopped the horse and looked at it for a moment. Then she went on. The ranch was there when she came over the last rise, and the barn was solid against the sky, and the mountains stood at the back of everything the way they always did. And she thought that this was the truth of it. Not that hardship builds character, which was the kind of thing people said and wasn't wrong, but wasn't the full thing. The full thing was this. Hardship shows you what you already are. It strips the non-essential, and what's left, whatever's left, is what you actually have to work with. What she'd had to work with was stubbornness and records and the capacity to say no to the wrong things, and yes to the right ones, even when the right ones were uncertain and imperfect and came with a 9-year-old who forged letters, and a man who walked the kitchen at 2 a.m, and a valley that was cold 10 months of the year. She would not have changed any of it. Not the platform in October, not the $42, not the narrow bed, or the frozen pump, or the second letter from Blackwell, or the sound of Wyatt's footsteps in the kitchen below her in the dark. All of it had been necessary. All of it had been, in the way that mattered, exactly enough. She drove the wagon into the yard and the dog came out to meet her. A stray Thomas had named Compass in October with zero subtlety. And somewhere in the barn she could hear Wyatt talking to one of the horses in the low, practical tone he used that was not so different from Thomas's tone with the same animals. And she thought that was something she'd noticed only recently, how much they were alike, in the ways that mattered, and how neither of them could always see it. She tied the horse and went inside to start the coffee and check the ledger she'd left open that morning and write the letter to the county education board that was 3 days overdue. And the mountains were there at the window, same as always, same as they'd be tomorrow, patient with all of it, in the particular way that old things were patient. Not gentle, not reassuring, just present. Present was enough. Present was everything.